She walked into that ballroom as nobody. She walked out changing everything. In front of 500 of Chicago's wealthiest guests, a woman in a yellow dress was slapped across the face, had her clothing torn apart, and was laughed off a live stream watched by millions, while the man who claimed to love her stood 3 feet away and said absolutely nothing. What they didn't know was that she controlled more money than everyone in that room combined. But that's not the story. The story is what happened after the silence. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this one travels. The thing nobody tells you about being worth $3 billion is how lonely the number actually is. Victoria Sinclair learned that at 24, sitting across a candlelit dinner table from a man named Preston Holt, who spent 40 minutes talking about her grandfather's legacy before he ever once asked what she liked for breakfast. She remembered smiling through it, nodding, refilling her own wine glass because Preston was too busy calculating what a merger with the Sinclair name might look like on paper. She drove home alone that night and sat in the parking garage of her penthouse building for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside. That was 6 years ago. Since then, she'd collected 5 more versions of Preston. Different names, different industries, different rehearsed compliments. All of them found her through the same door, the door with the Sinclair family crest above it. Not one of them had ever knocked on any other entrance. So at 29, Victoria Sinclair did something that her father called reckless, her legal team called inadvisable, and her therapist called quietly brave. She disappeared. Not literally. She still ran Sinclair Global Technologies from the 41st floor of a glass tower downtown. She still sat in board meetings that lasted 4 hours and made decisions that shifted markets. But outside of that building, outside of business hours, she became someone else entirely. Victoria Marsh. She'd kept her mother's maiden name tucked away for years, never using it professionally, and now she pulled it out like a clean shirt she'd been saving. She moved out of the penthouse and into a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. A nice building, not a mansion, the kind of place a successful project manager or a marketing director might rent. She drove a 4-year-old Honda Civic instead of the company car. She went to a regular grocery store on Saturday mornings and learned, embarrassingly late in life, how to comparison shop for pasta sauce. She told no one at work except her personal assistant, Maya, who'd been with her for 4 years and understood without needing it, explained. "How long?" Maya had asked. "I don't know," Victoria had answered honestly. "And if someone recognizes you," Victoria had shrugged, "then I'll deal with it." She didn't get recognized. That surprised her at first. She'd assumed her face was too public, too tied to the Sinclair name to simply vanish. But the truth was that people see what they expect to see. In a boardroom with her name on the agenda and her grandfather's portrait on the wall, Victoria Sinclair was unmistakable. In a coffee shop in Lincoln Park wearing a cream-colored sweater and reading a paperback, she was just another woman on a Tuesday. It was the most freedom she'd felt since she was a child. She met Daniel on a Wednesday in October, which she'd later decide was either wonderful timing or terrible timing, depending on the day she was having. She'd gone to a small coffee place called Kettlebell, named after some joke the owner had never properly explained, on Armitage Avenue. It wasn't particularly trendy, and the Wi-Fi was inconsistent, which meant the clientele were mostly people who actually wanted coffee rather than content. Victoria had started going there 3 weeks after moving to Lincoln Park, because the barista, a woman named Jo, never tried to make conversation beyond same as yesterday. And that felt like a gift. She was at her usual table near the window, working through a report on her laptop. She kept the logo covered with a sticker of a potted cactus, which Maya had found funny, when she heard the argument. It wasn't a shouting argument. It was the kind conducted in forced low voices by 2 people very aware of their surroundings. The man at the counter, tall and broad-shouldered, was showing something on his phone to Jo while simultaneously trying to explain why the order was wrong. Jo was holding her ground with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. A child, a boy of about 8, dark-haired and watching everything very carefully, stood slightly behind the man, holding the strap of his backpack with both hands. "Sir, I made exactly what you ordered," Jo said. "I ordered oat milk." "You said whole milk. I heard you, and my colleague heard you." "My son is lactose intolerant." Jo paused. Then, with genuine concern, "Is he okay?" The man, he hadn't even tasted the drink, Victoria realized. He'd opened the lid and smelled it or something, deflated a little. He hasn't had it yet. I need to get this right. We're running late. There was something in the way he said, I need to get this right, that made Victoria put down her coffee cup. Joe remade the drink, no charge, and the man thanked her 3 times. Then he turned around looking for somewhere to sit with this kid and a laptop bag slipping off his shoulder and a coffee in each hand, and the only open seat was across from Victoria. He caught her eye by accident. Sorry, he said reflexively, even though he hadn't done anything. You're fine, she said. He sat down. The boy climbed into the chair beside him and immediately pulled out a library book about dinosaurs, which Victoria clocked as a good sign about the adult supervising him. They didn't talk. The man opened his laptop, rubbed the back of his neck, and stared at something on his screen with the expression of a person confronting a problem they don't entirely know how to solve. Victoria went back to her report. 5 minutes later, the boy looked up from his dinosaur book and said very seriously across the table, Did you know a T-Rex's arms were actually strong? People think they're useless, but they could lift about 400 pounds. Victoria looked up. 400 pounds? Each arm. Huh. She considered this. That's more useful than most people's arms. The boy nodded like she'd said something deeply correct. The man, his father, clearly, looked up from his screen with an expression somewhere between amused and mortified. Marcus, he said, you can't just... She doesn't mind, Marcus said with absolute confidence. Victoria didn't mind. He's right, she said. I didn't know that. The man shook his head slowly, but he was half smiling. Sorry about him. He's been doing a paleontology deep dive for 2 weeks. There are worse phases. Tell that to me at 11 p.m. when he's still listing prehistoric shark species. Something eased between them, the way it does when strangers find they're speaking the same register. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, mid-level real estate manager, currently losing a quiet war against a comparative market analysis that refused to make sense. She introduced herself as Victoria Marsh, which was true in every way that mattered in that room. Marcus shook her hand formally and went back to his dinosaurs. What followed was not a sweep-you-off-your-feet romance. Victoria had had enough of those, smooth and fast and surface glittering, like ice that cracks the moment you actually step on it. This was slower, more tentative, full of the kind of small interruptions that real life provides when it isn't curated. Their first actual date, 2 weeks after the coffee shop, was dinner at a Thai place on Clark Street where the booth seats were slightly sticky and Daniel's phone rang twice, both times from his babysitter, both times causing him to apologize and check the screen with that coiled, alert quality of a person whose responsibilities don't clock out. The babysitter was fine. Marcus was fine. He just called to report that the babysitter had incorrectly identified a stegosaurus in a documentary, and Marcus felt this needed to be on record. Victoria laughed until she genuinely couldn't stop, and something about laughing that hard over something that small, felt like a door opening somewhere inside her chest. Their second date was a disaster. Daniel had an emergency at work, a property deal collapsing last minute, and had to cancel with 40 minutes' notice. She told him it was fine. It was fine. But she also sat in her car for a moment after hanging up, aware that she'd been looking forward to it more than she'd admitted to herself. He made it up to her the following Saturday. Took her and Marcus to the Art Institute. Not a romantic gesture, he explained, slightly self-conscious. But Marcus had a school project and the sitter canceled and he wasn't willing to just not go. She'd said she loved the Art Institute. She did love the Art Institute. What she didn't say was that she'd donated significantly to their modern wing renovation 3 years ago, and that the placard near the entrance that read the Sinclair Modern Gallery was something she silently navigated around all afternoon. But she looked at paintings she'd walked past 100 times and saw them through Marcus's running commentary, and Daniel stood beside her with his hands in his pockets and the comfortable quiet of someone who didn't feel the need to fill every silence. And she thought, this is what I've been trying to find. Over 8 months, they built something real. Not dramatic, real. He cooked for her twice, neither attempt fully succeeding. She helped Marcus with a book report on Charlotte's Web and got more invested than necessary in the argument about whether Wilbur truly understood what Charlotte sacrificed. She met Daniel's work colleagues at a casual happy hour and listened to their conversations about properties and commissions and the market, contributing nothing from her own world that might have signaled a different life. She thought about telling him the truth approximately 40 times. Each time she held back for a reason that felt solid in the moment and slightly flimsy in retrospect. She wanted to wait until it felt right. She wanted to know him better first. She wanted to be sure of what they were before she changed the composition of it. What she didn't admit to herself, not clearly, not until much later, was that she was afraid. Not of Daniel specifically, but of watching that thing in his eyes shift. That click of recalibration that happened every time the Sinclair name entered a room. She'd seen it so many times, the way attention sharpened and widened into something heavier than genuine interest. The way conversations that were going in one direction suddenly curved toward another. She was afraid of watching it happen to Daniel too. So she stayed quiet and let herself be Victoria Marsh, and let herself be happy in the way that people are happy when they know it costs something to keep it. It arrived on a Thursday in late March. Not a text, an actual invitation, heavy cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering, the kind that announced its own importance before you'd read a single word. The Brooks Family Annual Spring Gala, Grand Monarch Hotel, Chicago, black tie. 7 p.m. Daniel handed it to her at dinner, a place they'd started thinking of as their regular spot, a small Italian restaurant called Reno's where the owner knew their order, and watched her face while she read it. "It's a family thing," he said preemptively. "My mother hosts it every year. Big deal to her. I usually bring Marcus and suffer through 3 hours of my aunt asking about my investment portfolio." "Sounds fun," Victoria said, and meant exactly 50% of it. "I want you to come." He said it simply, without inflation. The way Daniel said most things that mattered. "I want them to meet you." She looked at him across the table. He was doing the thing he did sometimes. Not quite nervous, but aware of his own vulnerability, like he was holding something out but prepared to take it back without drama if she didn't want it. She'd found that quality in him remarkable from the beginning. Most men she'd known performed confidence like it was armor. Daniel had actual confidence, the quieter kind, the kind that could acknowledge uncertainty without crumbling. "Okay," she said. "It's formal." "I have a dress." He laughed softly. "My mother is a lot. Just so you know. She has opinions about everything, and she voices all of them. I've handled difficult people before." "Yeah, but—" He hesitated. "She's going to ask you questions about your family, your background, your career. She does that to everyone I've ever brought home. She's not subtle about what she's looking for." Victoria held his gaze steadily. "What is she looking for?" A beat passed. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable, which told her something. "Status," he said finally with a self-aware grimace. "She's very interested in status." Victoria thought about the irony of this for approximately 1 second. "I'll come," she said. What she didn't say, "I'll come as myself. And I need to know what that's worth to the people you love." She didn't tell him about Sinclair Global. She didn't tell him about her father or the company or the money. She told herself it was because she wanted one honest night, one room where she was just Victoria, and she could measure the temperature of what she walked into without the force field of wealth around her. She went home that night and stood in her closet for a long time. She owned dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, things she wore to fundraisers and shareholder events and industry dinners. And she owned things she'd bought since moving to Lincoln Park, practical and pretty, chosen because she liked them rather than because they communicated the right message to the right people. She pulled out the yellow dress. She'd bought it at a boutique on Milwaukee Avenue 3 months ago because the color made her feel like a different season entirely, like something lightening. It wasn't cheap exactly, but it wasn't communicating anything except woman who likes yellow. No statement jewelry, no name brand shoes, just a woman in a yellow dress going to a party because someone she cared about asked her. She hung it on the back of her door and looked at it for a while. Let them see just this, she thought. Let me see what just this is worth. The Grand Monarch Hotel on Michigan Avenue was the kind of building that understood its own importance and had for about 90 years. Limestone facade, brass fittings, a lobby with ceilings that made you aware of your own height in relation to the room. Victoria had attended no fewer than a dozen events here under her real name. She'd had dinner in the private dining room on the 14th floor with a former Treasury Secretary once, which had been considerably less interesting than it sounded. None of that was available to her tonight. She walked in on Daniel's arm as Victoria Marsh and felt the building's familiar weight differently. felt it the way someone without a name in its records would feel it. The doormen were polite. The coat check was efficient. The elevator bank was marble-floored and hushed. The ballroom was on the third floor. Daniel straightened his tie in the elevator mirror. He'd been quieter than usual during the car ride over, and she'd let him be, understanding that family events carried their own species of weight. He glanced at her now. "You look great," he said. "I know," she said, which made him laugh, which was what she'd wanted. The ballroom doors opened. 500 people. She registered that immediately. The crowd, the noise, the specific quality of wealthy event air, a mixture of perfume and floral centerpieces and catering warming trays, a jazz quartet in the corner, a silent auction display along one wall, tables set with white linen and enough silverware to communicate serious intent. She'd been in rooms like this her whole life, but she'd never been in one without armor. She felt it immediately. The quality of the glances. Not hostile, not yet. Just assessing. The kind of casual evaluation that happens in rooms where everyone is measuring everyone else against an internal scale. She registered the looks at her dress. Not cruel, just noticing. Noting what it was and wasn't. Daniel guided her through the room with one hand light at the small of her back, steering toward a cluster of people near the far end. She could see the family resemblance at 20 feet. The same jaw structure, the same particular way of holding the room as if it were natural territory. She saw Evelyn Brooks before Daniel said her name. A woman in her late 50s in a structured midnight blue gown, her silver hair precisely arranged, champagne flute held with the ease of someone who'd held one at every social event of her adult life. Beautiful, in a way that had been carefully maintained and was somewhat proud of that maintenance. Her eyes found Victoria and Daniel from across the room, and the assessment happened fast, thorough and practiced, and concluding something before any word had been exchanged. "Daniel," she said, reaching forward to receive his cheek kiss. Her eyes moved to Victoria with the second part of that greeting conspicuously missing. "Mom." He put his hand on Victoria's arm. "This is Victoria, Victoria Marsh." "Evelyn Brooks," his mother said. The handshake she offered was the kind that doesn't actually grip. "Lovely to meet you." The tone said clearly that it was too early to determine whether this was true. "You as well," Victoria said pleasantly. "Daniel talks about you often." "Does he?" Evelyn's gaze swept Victoria's dress with the efficiency of a woman who'd been calibrating others' wardrobes since before Victoria was born. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not rude, not yet. Just adjusting its estimate. "What a cheerful color," she said. Vanessa Brooks appeared 15 minutes later, which turned out to be approximately 15 minutes too late for Victoria's first impression to be anything other than what it was. Daniel's sister was 35, assembled with the kind of careful visual effort that was almost architectural. Hair, makeup, dress, accessories arranged to communicate a specific message at a specific volume. She was, Victoria would later find out, a lifestyle influencer with about 400,000 followers, which explained both the ring-light calluses Victoria spotted on her right thumb and the way Vanessa's eyes kept drifting to something beyond any conversation she was having, like she was already composing the caption. "Oh," Vanessa said, arriving at their small group and looking Victoria over with an expression that didn't bother to fully disguise itself. "You're the one Daniel's been seeing." "That would be me," Victoria said. "Cute dress." The word cute did a lot of work in that sentence that the word itself couldn't technically be blamed for. "Thank you." "Where did you get it?" Victoria named the boutique on Milwaukee Avenue. She saw Vanessa's smile adjust almost imperceptibly. "Oh, fun." Another word carrying cargo. "So Victoria, what is it you do?" "Real estate management, mostly," which wasn't entirely false. Sinclair Global had a significant real estate portfolio. "Oh, interesting. Like Daniel." "Adjacent." "And your family?" Evelyn had drifted back into the conversation with the ease of someone who did this habitually. "Are you from Chicago?" "Originally, I moved around for school." "Where did you go?" Victoria named a university. She'd done her undergrad at Northwestern, which was true, though she'd also done her MBA at Wharton, which she left out because Wharton would have led to questions. "Northwestern," Evelyn repeated, in a tone that filed this information under acceptable but not distinguished. Daniel went to DePaul. She said this in the affectionate, slightly defensive way of a mother who'd made peace with a choice she hadn't entirely loved. The questions kept coming. They weren't aggressive exactly in those first 20 minutes. They were the questions of people running a background check in real time, looking for the markers that would tell them what category to put her in. Family connections, professional titles, network names, the social vocabulary of Chicago's elite circles, which Victoria knew fluently but was refusing to speak tonight. Without those markers, she watched herself being quietly filed into a category she recognized. Unverified. Probably not one of us. Possibly a problem. She felt Daniel beside her, moving through his family's interrogation with the slightly worn patience of someone who'd done it many times before in other contexts. He answered some questions for her. He kept his hand near her but not attached, respectful of her independence. He wasn't performing anything. He was just there. She noticed he didn't push back on any of the questions. Not yet. She told herself that was fine. They weren't hostile yet, just evaluating. The trouble started with Daniel's uncle Richard, who arrived loudly from the direction of the bar and shook Daniel's hand with the grip of a man who considered handshakes a competitive sport. He was thick-necked and red-faced and had the energy of a person who'd started his evening slightly before the party did. This the girl? He looked at Victoria with zero pretense of courtesy. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Victoria asked, honestly curious. I don't know. Something more. He waved a hand vaguely. Daniel usually goes for a certain type. Richard, Daniel said flat. I'm just saying. She can hear you. I know she can hear me, Daniel. I'm talking to her. Victoria held eye contact with Richard and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Richard took a long pull from his drink and moved on, the way people like Richard always eventually move on, toward the next thing that could sustain their attention. But the room was starting to feel different. People nearby had been listening. Conversations around them carried an altered quality, a slight turn of attention in their direction. Vanessa had her phone out, thumb moving subtly. A camera was floating through the crowd, one of those party photographers working the room. But the angle it paused at felt deliberate. Victoria was aware of all of it. She kept her expression neutral and her back straight and her voice pleasant, because she'd grown up navigating rooms like this from the inside, and she knew that visible emotion was the first thing they looked for when they wanted confirmation of a verdict already reached. It started, in the way that these things always start, with something small. Evelyn had drawn a small group of women around her near the silent auction display, a cluster of the kind Victoria recognized, wives and daughters and sisters of the professionally established, performing the social rituals of their category. Victoria found herself within range of this group after Daniel was pulled aside by a colleague from work, some property situation requiring a quick 5-minute conversation that became 10. She stood near the auction display and looked at a framed print she didn't want, and waited for Daniel to come back, and she heard Evelyn's voice from 3 feet away. The dress is from a boutique on Milwaukee. Can you imagine? The laughter that followed was the quiet kind, the worse kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Something shifted in Victoria's chest, not quite anger, something older than anger. The specific weariness of a woman who knows she's being evaluated against a standard she didn't agree to. She turned away from the print and found Vanessa standing 2 feet behind her. You know, Vanessa said conversationally, and the phone in her hand had its camera visible. I actually looked up the boutique. They're not even on the North Shore buying circuit. No one we know shops there. Victoria looked at the phone, looked at Vanessa. Okay, she said. I'm just making an observation. Vanessa's voice carried the studied lightness of someone saying something they fully intend. It's a little bit, she tilted her head, unclear why someone like you is at an event like this. I was invited, Victoria said, by your brother. Sure, Vanessa smiled. Her thumb moved on the phone screen. But why are you seeing my brother? He's a single father. He has a child. He has certain expectations. And you're... The pause was surgical. You're very sweet, but you're not exactly Vanessa. Daniel's voice cut in from behind Victoria. He'd come back. Vanessa's expression didn't change much. We're just talking, Daniel. I can hear how you're talking. I'm having a conversation with your girlfriend. Isn't that what you wanted? For us to get to know each other? Something moved through the air between the siblings, an old current, something with history in it. Daniel looked at Vanessa and then at his mother, who had arrived at the edge of the group with the timing of someone following a script she'd written herself. "She doesn't belong here," Evelyn said. Not quietly, not carefully. Out loud, in the register of a woman who had never in her life been made to feel that her opinions required lowering. And there it was, in the open. The room around them had quieted in that particular way rooms do when something is about to happen. Conversations had thinned at the edges, attention redistributing. Victoria saw phone screens tilting upward in peripheral vision, recording, she understood. Vanessa's phone was openly forward now. Victoria stood very still. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at his mother. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle in his cheek working. She could see, in the absolute specificity of someone paying attention, the exact calculation happening behind his eyes. The family dynamic, the room, the weight of years of this woman's authority, the particular exhaustion of people who have spent their lives in proximity to someone like Evelyn Brooks. She waited for him to say something. He didn't. "This is embarrassing," Evelyn continued, her voice at that social carrying volume, not shouting, never shouting, just clear. "I don't know what story you've told my son, but events like this have a standard, and you are—" "Mom," Daniel said, and there was something, finally, firm in his voice, and Victoria felt herself breathe. But Evelyn's hand had already moved. The slap was precise, and without hesitation, the action of a woman who had made up her mind before the evening started. It caught Victoria across the left cheek with the crack of sound that silences every room it happens in. Victoria didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. Some automatic, deeply trained part of her absorbed it and stayed upright, because falling would have been worse. Some part of her brain had already assessed. The room was completely silent. Then Vanessa did something with her free hand, a sharp sideways motion that caught the shoulder seam of Victoria's dress and pulled, and the sound of fabric separating was small but carried in the silence like a gunshot, and someone nearby laughed, the uneasy laugh of crowd momentum finding a direction. More phones appeared. More screens tilted upward. Someone started clapping, then others. The specific cruelty of group momentum, the way people who would never individually choose an action will participate in it when the crowd has already decided. Victoria stood in the center of it, dress torn at the shoulder, cheek burning, standing in the ballroom of a hotel she'd been to dozens of times, and looked at Daniel. He was standing very still. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough to know. Long enough to see that the man she'd spent 8 months building something with was not, in this moment, going to choose her. Not in front of his mother, not in front of this room, not when it cost what it would cost. She saw it in his face. Not cruelty. Something worse. Paralysis. The guards were moving toward her now. She understood what was happening. Someone had called them. The momentum of the room had given someone the confidence to make that call, to manage the situation by removing the problem, which was her. She squared her shoulders. She looked at no one in particular. She did not look at Daniel again. And she heard it before she understood what it was. The sound came from above, deep and rhythmic, reverberating through the hotel's old bones, through the ballroom ceiling, through the floor beneath their feet. The sound of something large and serious landing on the roof. Helicopter blades. The ballroom doors opened 22 seconds later. She'd counted. Later, she wouldn't know why she'd counted, only that it had given her something to do while she stood there with a torn dress and burning face and 500 phones pointed in her direction. The security team came first. 4 of them, not the hotel security, different, the kind of men who wear the same earpiece and move like their job description includes the word threat assessment. The crowd parted for them automatically, the way crowds do when they suddenly understand they're not the most powerful thing in the room. And then Edward Sinclair walked through the ballroom doors. He was 62 years old and had spent 40 of those years building things and 20 of them protecting them. And every year of that was visible in the way he moved. Not aggressive, not performative, just the absolute settled weight of someone who had never once, in any room he'd ever walked into, wondered if he belonged there. He wasn't dressed for a gala. He was in his working suit, charcoal, no tie, the jacket slightly wrinkled from travel, the kind of detail that on someone else might have been a disadvantage, and on Edward Sinclair read simply as, "I came directly." He crossed the ballroom floor, and the crowd separated like water. His eyes found Victoria in approximately 3 seconds. She watched him take in the torn dress, the red mark on her cheek, the phone screens surrounding her. She watched his face do what her father's face very rarely did, what she could count on one hand the number of times she'd seen it do. He went completely still, in the way that wasn't stillness at all, but something contained beneath it, something with real pressure behind it. He reached her without acknowledging a single other person in the room. He took off his jacket. He put it around her shoulders with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that the gesture had to be right, that being in the room meant all of it would be seen, and what he wanted visible was, "This is my daughter, and I am here." The jacket smelled like cedar and airplane and the particular scent of his office that she'd associated with safety for as long as she could remember, and she felt something crack quietly behind her sternum. She didn't cry. She would not cry in this room. But she felt it, the giving way of something she'd been holding rigid for the last 10 minutes. Edward turned. He faced Evelyn Brooks, who had gone the color of old chalk. He didn't raise his voice. Edward Sinclair almost never raised his voice. She'd seen him negotiate deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the same register he used to order coffee, and the effect was the same. The sense that the voice was controlled because the man behind it had decided the situation was already handled and there was no need for volume. "You assaulted my daughter," he said. 3 words beyond that sentence, and the room had already processed what those 4 words meant. The murmur that moved through 500 people was not a single sound, but a spreading one. The ripple of recognition, of recalibration, of people realizing that the variable they'd assigned a value to had an entirely different value, and the math they'd been running for the last 2 hours was completely wrong. His daughter, Sinclair. That was Victoria Sinclair. Evelyn's champagne flute was shaking slightly. She became aware of this and gripped it harder, which made it more visible. Beside her, Vanessa's phone had lowered. No longer recording, or perhaps no longer sure what she was recording and what it was going to cost her when people saw it. Daniel hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same position, 3 feet from where he'd been standing when his mother's hand connected with Victoria's face. He was looking at her, at Victoria, and she could see the full weight of what was landing on him, the domino collapse of comprehension, the understanding of what he'd been given and what he'd watched happen and what he'd not done. Victoria took a breath. She had not planned what she was going to say. She was not a woman who made speeches. She gave presentations in boardrooms and interviews in controlled environments, but unscripted moments in front of crowds had never been something she sought out. But the room was listening, and Daniel was listening, and she was so tired. Not angry, not anymore, just the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had finally seen something clearly after a long time of looking at it in bad light. She spoke quietly. She didn't project. People leaned in to hear her, which meant they had to choose to, which meant it was theirs to keep. "I came here tonight as myself," she said. "Not as a CEO, not as a Sinclair, just Victoria. In a dress I bought because I liked the color." She paused. She looked at Daniel because this part was for him, regardless of who else was listening. "I wanted to know if you loved me the way you thought you did. Without the money, without the name, without the things that make people decide you're worth standing up for." She felt her voice stay even. She was grateful for that. "I have my answer now." Daniel opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, gently. Not cruel, just clear. "Not right now. Not here." She looked at the room, at the hundreds of people with their phones and their expressions cycling through stages, and she felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vindication, just clarity. The particular, almost sorrowful clarity of a moment when you understand exactly what something was and what it wasn't. She looked at her father. Edward offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked out of the ballroom of the Grand Monarch Hotel while 500 people watched, and several million more would watch in the hours that followed, and she didn't look back. Her father's car was a black SUV, engine running at the hotel's service entrance. He'd thought of everything, as he always did. Inside there was a suit jacket that actually fit her. Maya's work, she suspected, Maya who had probably made 3 phone calls in the time it took Edward to land that helicopter, and a bottle of water, and the particular absence of questions that her father knew sometimes mattered more than anything else. They rode in silence for a while. Chicago slid past the windows. She watched the lights. How did you know? She asked finally. Maya called me. He paused. The live stream. She nodded. Of course. I told you not to, he started. I know. Victoria, but I know, Dad. She turned to look at him. But I had to know. I had to know what it was made of when there was nothing else in the room. Edward looked at her for a moment. He wasn't a man who was easily surprised, but she could see him processing something behind his eyes. Not the situation, something older than the situation. And? He said. She turned back to the window. It wasn't made of enough, she said quietly. Her father said nothing. He reached over and put his hand briefly over hers. A gesture she could count on one hand how many times he'd made it, and then withdrew and looked out his own window. And they rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that isn't empty. She sat with the weight of 8 months, with coffee shops and Thai restaurant booths, and museum afternoons and Marcus's dinosaur facts and late-night phone calls. She sat with the specific texture of something she'd built carefully and discovered was built on a foundation that hadn't been tested, not really, until tonight. She sat with the silence of someone she loved, and she felt the shape of it, how exactly the size of a person's silence can be when you've been waiting for them to fill it with your name. The city lights moved past. Victoria Marsh pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself feel all of it, because she knew, she'd always known, that you didn't get to heal what you weren't willing to feel. She stayed at her father's house that night. She called Maya in the morning. She put on the coffee herself, standing in her father's kitchen in borrowed clothes, and watched it brew, and thought about yellow dresses and what it cost to be just yourself in a room full of people who had decided your value before you'd said a word. She thought about Daniel standing 3 feet away. She thought about the silence, and she understood finally and completely that the most painful distances in the world are not the long ones. They are the small ones, the ones measured in feet rather than miles, the ones between 2 people standing in the same room. The video was 11 minutes and 43 seconds long. That was how much of Victoria's humiliation had been captured, edited with the kind of instinctive pacing that comes from years of knowing what holds an audience, and uploaded to Vanessa Brooks's social media accounts before midnight. By 2 in the morning, it had 4 million views. By 6 a.m., it had 14. By the time Victoria woke up in her father's guest room, still in borrowed clothes, her phone face down on the nightstand because she hadn't been able to look at it, the number had stopped being something she could easily process. Maya texted her the figure at 7:42 a.m. with no editorial comment, which was its own kind of editorial comment. 38.7 million views across platforms. Growing. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed and looked at those numbers for a while. Outside the window, her father's garden was doing what Chicago gardens do in late March. Surviving more than thriving, the early bulbs coming up gray-green through soil that hadn't quite decided to commit to spring yet. She watched a sparrow land on the bird bath her mother had chosen 25 years ago, still there, a little weathered now. She picked up the phone. She didn't open social media. She opened her messages. Daniel had texted 11 times between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. She could see the preview lines without opening them. Victoria, please, and I'm so sorry, and I didn't know how to... And she set the phone back down without reading further. Not because she didn't feel it, because she felt it too much, and she needed breakfast before she felt anything at that volume. She found her father in the kitchen, already dressed, already into his second coffee. Edward Sinclair ran on about 5 hours of sleep and had for as long as she could remember, a habit she'd inherited and never been grateful for until she started running a company herself. "There's eggs," he said, without looking up from his tablet. "I see them." She made eggs. He read. It was the specific domesticity of 2 people who love each other and have also, over many years, figured out how to occupy the same space without performing their relationship for each other. She appreciated it more than she could say. "The board is going to want a statement," he said eventually. "I know." Communications has drafted 3 options. I'll look at them this afternoon. Victoria. He set down the tablet. The video has the slap, the dress, all of it. The context is clear to anyone watching. You're not the problem in this story. But the longer we say nothing, the more room there is for other people to define what happened. She stirred her eggs and thought about this. He wasn't wrong. He was almost never wrong about the strategic dimension of things, which had made him formidable in business and occasionally exhausting as a father. "I know, Dad. I said this afternoon." He picked the tablet back up. She ate her eggs. The sparrow was still at the bird bath. "How are you?" he asked. It came out slightly stiff, the way emotional questions always came out of Edward Sinclair, like a man reading from a phrasebook in a language he studied late in life but was genuinely trying to use. She looked at him. "I'll be okay." "That's not what I asked." She put her fork down. "I'm sad," she said. "I'm angry, but the anger is easier. The sad part is, it's just sad. I really liked him, Dad. I thought I'd found—" She stopped, restarted. "I thought I was finally reading someone correctly." Edward was quiet for a moment. "You did read him correctly," he said. "You just read the wrong chapter." She looked at him, surprised. Her father rarely said things like that. He shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with his own observation, and went back to his tablet. She finished her eggs. By 9 a.m., she was on a call with communications. By 10, she was on another with legal, because Evelyn Brooks had retained a publicist overnight, an interesting defensive move. And the publicist had released a statement suggesting that the evening had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media. The statement lasted approximately 40 minutes before the backlash from people who had watched all 11 minutes and 43 seconds made it untenable. Vanessa had deleted the video by then, which was several hours too late, and had replaced it with a post that said, "Only taking time to reflect," which was currently receiving the kind of comment section engagement that no publicist on earth could manage. Victoria read all of this in the back of a car on the way to her own office, because life had this particular quality of not pausing for personal devastation. And Sinclair Global had 3 pending acquisition reviews and a shareholder call on Thursday that didn't care about gala footage. She walked into her building through the private entrance on the side street, took the executive elevator, and arrived on the 41st floor to find Maya already there, with coffee and a face that contained the controlled emotion of someone who had opinions and was deciding which ones were professional to voice. "Don't," Victoria said. "I didn't say anything," Maya said. "I could hear you thinking it. I was thinking that you looked tired and that the communications draft B is the strongest of the 3 options." Maya set the coffee on Victoria's desk. "And that I'm glad you're okay." Victoria sat down in her chair. Her actual chair in her actual office, with the city 41 floors below her and her grandfather's original company seal on the wall and $3 billion of enterprise value somewhere in the numbers she'd look at in an hour. She sat in the middle of all of it and felt, quietly, the distance between this room and the Lincoln Park apartment where she'd been just Victoria Marsh, and how strange it was that the Lincoln Park version of her felt, in some ways, more like the truth. "Draft B," she said. "Let me see it." The statement went out at noon. It was 4 sentences. It didn't mention the Brooks family by name. It confirmed that the video was authentic. It said that Victoria believed in speaking about events when she had clarity rather than when she had emotion, and it ended by saying that she was grateful for the response from people who had watched it, and that character, not circumstance, was the only standard worth holding. By 1 p.m., it had been shared 900,000 times. By 3 p.m., the phrase character, not circumstance, was trending. Victoria, by then in a shareholder prep meeting, was not watching the numbers. Maya was watching the numbers and occasionally passing her handwritten notes, which was a system they'd developed during earnings calls when someone said something that needed real-time reaction. The note at 3:47 p.m. said, "Vanessa's sponsorships pulling, 4 confirmed." The note at 4:15 p.m. said, "Brooks Real Estate Holdings, investor call, reportedly canceled. 2 firms walking." Victoria looked at these notes and felt something complicated. Not satisfaction, not exactly. Something more like the awareness of consequence. The way you watch a stone drop into water and know the ripples are physics, not revenge. And they're going to keep moving outward at the same rate, regardless of how you feel about it. She hadn't made a single call. She hadn't asked her father to do anything. She'd released 4 sentences. The rest was people watching 11 minutes and 43 seconds and deciding what they thought about it. She folded both notes and put them in her jacket pocket and went back to the shareholder prep. That night, alone in her Lincoln Park apartment, she'd gone back because running from it felt wrong, like admitting the apartment meant less to her than the incident. She finally opened Daniel's messages. There were 14 by then. She read all of them. They were, in their way, everything she might have wanted to hear if she'd received them 3 hours earlier. He was sorry. He was genuinely, wrenchingly sorry, the kind of sorry that doesn't perform itself but trips over its own words and backtracks and starts over. He talked about his mother in ways that were honest rather than excusing, the weight of that dynamic, the years of it, the specific paralysis of standing in a room full of people you grew up performing adequacy for. He talked about Victoria in ways that made her chest hurt. He said he loved her, which she already knew, and which changed less than he seemed to think it would. The last message, sent at 3:06 a.m., said only, "I know I don't get to ask for anything right now. I just needed you to know that I see it. What I didn't do. I see it completely." She sat with that for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the coffee table, pulled a blanket up, and watched the city lights through her window until she fell asleep on the couch, which was not a habit she was proud of, but which happened sometimes when the bed felt too deliberate. She did not reply to Daniel's messages that night. She wasn't ready to decide what they meant yet. The morning brought Marcus. She hadn't expected that. She was making coffee at 7:30 a.m. when her buzzer rang, and when she answered it, the voice on the other end was small and familiar, and said, with the directness that was entirely his own, "It's Marcus. My dad doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I'm at the library." She stood at her intercom for a moment. "Marcus," she said, "the library opens at 9. A pause. "I know. Can I come up?" She buzzed him in. He arrived at her door with his dinosaur backpack and his library card visible in his jacket pocket, as if he'd grabbed it as a prop, and he looked at her with the grave, assessing look of an 8-year-old who had seen something he was trying to process and had decided, with the logic available to him, that coming here was the thing to do. She stepped back and let him in. He sat at her kitchen counter while she poured his orange juice. She kept it because he liked it, which was the kind of small habit she'd accumulated over 8 months without noticing. And he looked at his glass for a moment before he said, "I saw the video." "Ah," she said. "Dad said I shouldn't watch it, but it was on 4 different kids' phones at school, and I saw it anyway." He looked up. "That lady hit you." "She did." "That's not okay." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, rotating his juice glass on the counter. "Is it because of us? Me and my dad? Like, is this our fault?" She sat down on the stool across from him. She looked at him directly, the way she'd found he responded to better than the soft, sideways approach adults often took with kids. "No," she said, "not even a little bit. Some people are unkind because they've decided the world works a certain way, and when someone doesn't fit that picture, they get—" she searched for the right word— "uncomfortable. That's not on you or your dad." Marcus considered this. "Dad cried last night," he said. She held very still. "He was in the kitchen and he thought I was asleep, but I heard him." Marcus looked at his juice glass. "My dad doesn't cry. He cried once when my mom died and I didn't see it then. I just heard about it after, so—" She breathed carefully. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to go to the actual library because your dad is going to worry. Are you and my dad going to be okay?" She looked at this 8-year-old boy with his library card and his dinosaur backpack, who had taken a city bus across Lincoln Park at 7:30 in the morning because he needed to make sure someone was all right. And she felt something shift somewhere in her chest, not toward Daniel, not yet, but toward the thing Daniel had somehow managed to build in the aftermath of loss. This specific kid who showed up places with evidence in his pocket and honest questions on his face. "I don't know yet," she said. "But you coming here, that was a really good thing to do." He nodded, satisfied with this, the way he was satisfied with information that was accurate rather than comfortable. He drank his juice. She called him a rideshare to the library, which he accepted without argument, and she watched him get into the car from her window and thought about all the ways love announces itself that have nothing to do with the people it's actually between. She called Daniel 20 minutes later. He picked up on the first ring. "Marcus came to see me," she said. A long exhale. "I'm going to have a very serious conversation with him about—" "Don't," she said. "He did the right thing." Silence. Then, "Victoria." "I'm not ready to talk about us yet," she said. I need you to know that first. I'm not ready, and I'm not going to pretend I am. I know that. But I want you to know that I read everything you sent, and She stopped, restarted. I heard you. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one in the ballroom. This one had breath in it. Okay, Daniel said. His voice was careful and exhausted and real. Okay. Thank you. She hung up and stood at her window for a while. Outside, spring was still making up its mind. A few more bulbs had come up overnight in the window boxes across the street, pale yellow, insisting on themselves despite the temperature. She was not ready to forgive him. She didn't know yet if forgiveness was the right word for what she was working toward, or whether what she needed first was simpler and harder. Just time to figure out what exactly she'd lost, and what, if anything, was still intact. But she was a woman who'd spent 2 years learning to live without armor, and she knew something about the difference between protecting yourself and closing yourself off. And she wasn't going to confuse the two now just because it hurt. She went to work. She had a company to run. What followed in the next 2 weeks had the quality of watching a building come down. Not explosively, but the way old structures actually fall when the load-bearing elements fail, with a slow inevitability that's almost hard to watch precisely because you can see each stage. Brooks Real Estate Holdings lost its primary institutional investor on a Tuesday. The firm cited reputational concerns related to key stakeholders, which was the kind of language that corporate communications departments use when what they mean is, we watched that video and we don't want our name near this. 2 regional clients terminated contracts by the end of the week. The company's managing partner, not a Brooks family member, a career professional who'd been there 11 years, issued a careful statement expressing confidence in the company's fundamentals while simultaneously, according to 3 separate industry sources, updating his LinkedIn profile. Daniel lost his position on a Thursday. His firm hadn't been connected to his family's company, but the scandal had done what scandals do. It had attached itself to a name, and Daniel Brooks was that name, and the managing director had called him into an office and used words like optics and capacity to focus and mutual agreement, and by the end of the conversation, Daniel was carrying a banker's box to his car in the parking garage. He didn't tell Victoria immediately. She found out through Maya, who had set up alerts on the family because that was Maya's version of protective instinct. Victoria sat with this information and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Uncomplicated sorrow on his behalf. Not satisfaction, not the clean vindication that the internet seemed to expect her to perform. Just the sadness of knowing that a person she'd cared about was standing in a parking garage holding a box that contained his professional life, and that the sequence of events that had brought him there had started with him not saying her name when he should have. The distance between action and consequence wasn't always proportional. She'd always known that. She'd watched enough of them in her career. Evelyn Brooks hired a crisis PR firm on the same day her son lost his job. The firm's strategy was, in retrospect, predictable. Position Evelyn as a protective mother who had overreacted out of concern for her son, soften the slap into a moment of emotion rather than a calculated humiliation, introduce uncertainty about what had actually happened by the time cameras were rolling. They planted 2 articles in outlets that didn't ask too many questions. They secured a brief interview with a friendly television host. The problem with this strategy was the video. You could reframe a lot of things. You could not reframe 11 minutes and 43 seconds of footage that had been watched by 50 million people in multiple countries, several of whom had translated the English captions into 17 languages. The attempt to reframe it made things worse. The comparison between what Evelyn's PR said and what the video showed was not a subtle discrepancy, and the internet was not especially patient with non-subtle discrepancies. By the end of week 2, Evelyn Brooks had become one of those names that attached to a cultural moment. Not because anyone had targeted her specifically, because the footage was undeniable, and because her response to the footage was to deny it anyway, and because people who had experienced similar moments in similar rooms, being dismissed for what they wore or who their family was or how much their shoes cost, found the video and watched it and shared it with the comment, "I know this exact feeling." That was what Victoria hadn't anticipated. Not the scale of the response, she'd known the exposure would be significant, but the quality of it. The letters started arriving through Sinclair Global's public inbox. Hundreds, then thousands. Women who'd been written off at family events. Men who'd been dismissed from rooms based on what they were wearing. People who'd stood in ballrooms or boardrooms or living rooms while someone with more status made a decision about their worth in real time. She read them when she could. Not all of them. There were too many, but enough to understand what had happened. The video had become a mirror. Not for the Brooks family. For everyone watching. Maya brought her a printed selection one afternoon. 40 or 50 emails, which she said represented maybe 2% of what had come in. Victoria read them at her desk after everyone else had gone home. The office quiet around her, Chicago lit up below. One letter was from a woman in Memphis who'd been dismissed from a job interview because the interviewer had seen her neighborhood on her address. One was from a man in Seattle who'd watched his girlfriend's family treat her exactly as Evelyn had treated Victoria, word for word, and who had stood silent for the same reasons Daniel had, and who had lost her anyway, and who wanted Victoria to know that watching the video had been like watching himself do it again in slow motion. One was from a 19-year-old college student who said simply, "You walked out of there with your back straight, and I'm going to remember that the next time someone looks at me like I don't belong in the room I'm standing in." Victoria sat with that last one for a while. She put the printed emails in the drawer of her desk, the one that didn't have files in it, the one she used for things that were personal rather than professional. And she sat in her office for a few more minutes after that, looking at the city. She was 30 years old. She had run a company worth $3 billion for 2 years. She had navigated shareholder revolts and acquisition battles, and a board of directors that had initially voted against her appointment in a meeting she'd had to fight to even attend. She had done all of this in a landscape that was not built with her in mind, wearing the armor that landscape required. And she had tried, for 8 months in a yellow dress, to find out if any of it was negotiable. If there was a version of her life that was about more than the company. If there was a room somewhere that was just hers. The answer she'd gotten in the ballroom of the Grand Monarch Hotel had not been the one she'd hoped for. But the 19-year-old's email was not nothing. You walked out of there with your back straight. She hadn't chosen that. It had happened automatically, some trained, self-preserving part of her that had refused to let the room see the collapse while she was still in it. But maybe that was its own kind of truth. The fact that whatever you'd built inside yourself showed up in your posture when everything else was being stripped away. She turned off her desk lamp and went home. The scheduled television interview had been Maya's idea first, and then communications, and then finally Victoria's own when she realized that the absence of her voice in the public conversation was being filled by other people's versions of it. She'd been quiet for 2 weeks, present only in that 4-sentence statement, and in that silence, multiple narratives were trying to establish themselves. The humbled billionaire, the poor little rich girl, the calculated reveal, as one particularly unpleasant opinion piece had suggested, implying the entire evening had been orchestrated for publicity. That last one made her laugh in a way that had nothing funny in it. She agreed to a 20-minute interview with a journalist named Priya Chakraborty, who had a reputation for asking the questions that people in power didn't want to answer and for doing it without cruelty. They met at Sinclair Global's conference room. Not a studio, not a staged living room, just a room with a table and 2 chairs and good lighting, which had been Victoria's condition. Priya Chakraborty arrived 5 minutes early, which Victoria clocked as a professional habit and approved of. She was compact and observant and had the alert stillness of a person who listened for a living. They shook hands. They sat down. "I'm not going to ask you to describe what happened at the gala," Priya said, before the recorder was even on. 50 million people have seen it. They know what happened. "Good," Victoria said. "What I want to talk about is what you were actually doing there. Why the yellow dress? Why Victoria Marsh instead of Victoria Sinclair?" Priya tilted her head slightly. "I think that's the part people don't fully understand yet." Victoria looked at her. "That's a more honest question than I expected." "I try." The recorder went on. They talked for 32 minutes, which was 12 minutes over the agreed time, because the conversation went places that neither of them had exactly planned. Victoria talked about the years of Preston Holtz and their variants. She talked about Lincoln Park and what it had felt like to buy pasta sauce based on what she actually wanted, rather than what was appropriate for someone with her net worth. She talked about Daniel without using his name, which Priya didn't push on. And she talked about what she'd been hoping to discover by walking into that room without the family name in front of her. "And what did you discover?" Priya asked. Victoria considered the question for a moment. I discovered that the experiment worked, she said. Just not the way I'd hoped. I found out exactly what was underneath, when there was nothing on top. That's real information. It hurts, but it's real. That's a very collected way to talk about what sounds like a painful experience. I'm not collected, Victoria said. I've just had 2 weeks to start turning it into something I can live with. Is there anything you regret about the evening? I regret not telling him the truth sooner. She said it without hesitation. Not because it would have changed the gala. I don't know if it would have, but he deserved the whole truth of who I was before I put us both in that situation. She paused. That's the part that's on me. Everything else, She stopped, started again. Everything else was its own revelation. One last question, Priya said. What do you want people to take from this? If there's something. Victoria looked at the recorder on the table between them. She thought about the emails in her desk drawer, the woman in Memphis, the man in Seattle who'd stood silent at exactly the wrong moment and lost someone anyway, the 19-year-old with the straight-back comment. Character matters more than money, she said slowly. The way you treat someone when you think they have nothing, that's not just about money. It's about power, about status, about who you think gets to be in what room. And I think a lot of people have been in that room, on the receiving end of that look, that assessment. She met Priya's eyes. I just happened to have the receipts. Priya smiled at that. Thank you, she said, and meant it. The interview aired that evening. By morning, the phrase I just happened to have the receipts had joined character, not circumstance, in the ongoing life of the moment. Victoria watched neither trend. She was in a Thursday shareholder call, navigating a question about Q2 projections with the part of her brain that had been doing this for 2 years, while the other part, the part that couldn't be fully turned off, kept returning to Marcus's face at her kitchen counter, juice glass rotating in his hands, asking with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to make his worry less visible. Is it because of us? She kept thinking about Daniel in a parking garage with a box. She kept thinking about the emails in her drawer. She kept thinking about the ballroom and then the car and then her father's hand briefly over hers, that rare, awkward, entirely genuine gesture, and what he'd said, which she'd been turning over ever since. You read him correctly. You just read the wrong chapter. She didn't know yet what the right chapter looked like. She didn't know if there was one, or if the book was a different kind of story than she'd thought. Not the love story she'd been reading it as, but something else. A lesson she needed. A mirror she'd been due. She didn't know. But she was a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, that not knowing was not the same as being lost. She closed the shareholder call. She signed 3 documents Maya put in front of her. She looked at her phone. Daniel hadn't messaged in 4 days. She'd asked for space, and he was giving it to her, which was either the right thing or too little too late, and she genuinely could not tell which yet. She set the phone face down on her desk. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in the first real week of April. Deciding, finally and grudgingly, that the season had changed, the sky going that particular late afternoon blue that makes the buildings look like they've been polished. She'd loved this city her whole life in the specific way you love places that are difficult, that demand something of you just for staying. She thought about yellow dresses. She thought about what it cost to walk into a room as yourself. And she thought about whether she would do it again. Wear the ordinary dress, give the ordinary name, let herself be evaluated by the ordinary standard. And what surprised her was that the answer wasn't the one she might have predicted 2 weeks ago. Yes, she thought, because the alternative, the armor, the name on the door, the force field of wealth keeping people at exactly the distance it decided was safe, wasn't living. It was managing. She'd spent enough of her life managing. She turned back to her desk. There were 3 acquisition reviews still waiting, a foundation board meeting next week, a charity fundraiser in 6 weeks that Maya had already put on the calendar for an organization that built transitional housing for families in crisis. She pulled the first acquisition review toward her and picked up her pen. The day was not done. Neither was she. 3 weeks after the gala, Daniel Brooks was sitting in a coffee shop that wasn't Kettlebell. He'd tried going back to Kettlebell once, the Tuesday after everything fell apart, and Joe had looked at him with an expression that wasn't unkind but wasn't neutral either. The expression of someone who had watched a video 11 million times shared and knew which side of the counter the problem had been on. He'd ordered his coffee, said thank you, and not gone back. Some places belong to specific versions of your life, and when those versions end, the places end with them. He understood that now. The new coffee shop was called Perch on Halstead, anonymous and adequate. He sat at a table near the back with his laptop open and a job listing website on the screen and a cursor blinking in the search field that he'd been looking at for 40 minutes without typing anything. His phone buzzed. He looked at it reflexively, the way he'd been looking at his phone for 3 weeks, hoping each time that it was Victoria, and each time it wasn't, feeling the specific letdown of someone who had done the thing that required letdown and had no one to be angry at about it but himself. It was his mother. He turned the phone face down. Evelyn had called him 7 times since the gala, left 4 voicemails. The voicemails had progressed through stages. The first one positioning herself as the wronged party, the second one softer, the third one arriving at something like justification wrapped in maternal concern. The fourth one, which arrived after the PR firm's strategy had publicly collapsed, containing a quality he'd rarely heard from her and almost didn't recognize: uncertainty. She hadn't gone all the way to sorry. Evelyn Brooks had never in his memory gone all the way to sorry, but there was something in that fourth voicemail that rattled around in him in the quiet hours of the night, because it was the closest he'd heard his mother come to admitting that a wall she'd built around herself might have cracks in it. He hadn't called her back yet. He told himself it was because he was still processing. That was true, but there was another layer beneath it that was harder to look at directly. The fact that calling his mother back required confronting his own role in the evening, and he wasn't entirely sure he was ready to have that conversation with her while he was still in the middle of having it with himself. What he'd said to Victoria in those 14 text messages, he'd meant all of it. He meant it more clearly now than he had at 3 a.m. when he'd sent the last one, because time had not softened the self-knowledge, only made it more precise. He had stood 3 feet away from a woman he loved while his family dismantled her in front of 500 people in a live stream, and he had not stopped it. He'd said one word, her name once, to Vanessa. And then the slap happened, and he'd frozen in the specific way that 8-year-old Daniel had learned to freeze when Evelyn Brooks entered a room with that particular set to her jaw. The one that meant the decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was how much noise the outcome would make. He was 32 years old, and he had reverted in the worst possible moment to a child's strategy. He knew this. He'd known it in the ballroom, watching Victoria's face while his mother's PR narrative was still just beginning its short life. He'd seen the exact moment she understood that he wasn't going to move, and he'd watched something in her expression do the thing that faces do when they're deciding to stop waiting for something that isn't coming. That was the image that woke him up at 4 a.m. Not the slap, not the torn dress, not Edward Sinclair walking through the doors with his daughter's devastation visible in every line of his face. Victoria's expression in the second before his mother's hand moved, the held breath quality of someone giving a person one final second to be who they hoped he was. He hadn't been who she'd hoped. Marcus had asked him, 2 days after the gala, sitting at the kitchen table over cereal, and with the pragmatic directness that Daniel had cultivated in his son, because he genuinely believed it was a better tool than whatever decorative version of childhood honesty most people encouraged. "Did you do something wrong?" Daniel had looked at his son for a moment. "Yeah," he'd said. "I did." Marcus had chewed his cereal and thought about this. "Are you going to fix it?" "I don't know if it's fixable." "What does that mean?" "It means..." He'd searched for the version that was honest without being more than an 8-year-old needed to carry. "It means sometimes when you don't do the right thing at the right moment, the moment is gone. And the person you didn't do it for gets to decide whether they want to give you a different moment." Marcus had considered this with the grave thoroughness he applied to paleontology and book reports. "That seems fair," he said finally. "Yeah," Daniel said, "it is." Marcus had gone to Victoria's apartment the next morning without telling him, which Daniel had discovered only when a rideshare receipt appeared on his shared family account. A trip from the library, which Marcus had been dropped at, to a Lincoln Park address Daniel recognized immediately at 7:44 a.m. He'd sat with that for a while. His son, 8 years old, had done what he should have done, had gotten on a bus in the early morning to go check on someone and make sure she knew she mattered. He'd been parenting Marcus to be that kind of person. It turned out the parenting had worked better than the parent. Now, 3 weeks out, he was sitting in perch on Halstead with a blinking cursor and a face full of the kind of exhaustion that sleep didn't fix because it wasn't the physical kind. He had savings. He had time. He had no professional address and no salary and a resume that currently existed in a landscape where his name had become, temporarily at least, a liability. 3 firms had looked at his LinkedIn in the past 2 weeks. He'd gotten no callbacks. He knew why. He wasn't angry about why. It was consequence, and he'd spent enough time in the past weeks developing a clearer understanding of consequence to be able to look at it without flinching too much. He typed real estate manager into the search field, then deleted it. Then typed Chicago property management and looked at what came up and knew that half the names on the list were companies that had been at the Grand Monarch Hotel that night, or were connected to people who had, because Chicago's real estate and investment world was large on paper and considerably smaller in practice. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Vanessa. He stared at her name on the screen. His sister had texted him 6 times since the gala and called twice. The texts had been, in chronological order, defensive, then explanatory, then something that was trying to be an apology without fully committing to the form, then a link to her PR team's draft statement asking for his input, which he had not provided, then silence for a week, then this. He didn't know what this was yet. He looked at the notification preview. Dan, I know you're not picking up, but I need to... He put the phone in his jacket pocket without reading the rest. He was not ready for Vanessa yet either. He was aware that this avoidance was its own kind of problem, that the conversations he was postponing with his family were conversations that needed to happen, that the Brooks dynamic that had produced the gala like a slow pressure finally finding a crack didn't repair itself through silence. He knew that. But he also knew that he couldn't have those conversations from a place of being this tired and this raw and this genuinely uncertain about his own moral inventory, because they would just become about who was most sorry rather than about what had built the thing that broke. He ordered a second coffee he didn't entirely want. At the counter, the barista, a young woman with a nose ring and the practiced efficiency of someone working a double shift, handed it to him and said without looking up, "You're the guy from the video." He stopped. She glanced at him. Not unkind, just noting. "The gala thing, Brooks, right?" "Yeah," he said. "Huh." She gave him his change. That was something. He didn't ask her to elaborate. He took his coffee back to his table and sat there for a moment with the particular feeling of being recognized in a context that was not flattering, which was a new experience and not one he had previously thought much about. He'd been a private person his whole life. Mid-level. Someone who moved through the world without generating attention. Whatever recognition his family name had carried in certain circles had always been ambient background, not something that landed on him directly. This was different. He thought about Victoria, who had lived with this quality of being known her whole life, but who had built around herself the specific competence to navigate it, and who had tried for 8 months to live without needing to. He thought about what it had cost her to build that life in Lincoln Park. The deliberate smallness of it, the Honda Civic and the boutique on Milwaukee Avenue and the coffee shop where she went because the barista didn't make conversation. He thought about her sitting across from Marcus at that kitchen counter, giving his son an honest answer about something difficult, and the quality of ease in her face when she did it. The ease of someone who had found a space where they didn't have to calculate. He'd given her that space. For 8 months. And then he'd let it be taken apart in public while he stood there doing the calculus of his family's emotional leverage. He drank his coffee. He typed into the search field for another 40 minutes, applied to 2 positions that felt like long shots and one that felt realistic. Closed the laptop, looked at his phone. He opened Vanessa's message. "Dan, I know you're not picking up, but I need to talk to you. Not about PR, not about Mom, about me. I know what I did. I need to say it to an actual person, not a publicist. Call me when you can." He read it twice. Then he put the phone away again, because he needed another day with it, and he gave himself permission to need that, which was also something he was still learning. Across the city, in a conference room on the 41st floor of a building Daniel had never been inside, the consequences of the Grand Monarch Hotel were moving through a different set of channels. Edward Sinclair had made one phone call in the days following the gala. 1. He had not directed it toward the Brooks family, had not called in favors or targeted anyone specifically. He had called his chief investment officer, Gerald Park, and told him to conduct a full review of Sinclair Global's indirect exposure to Brooks real estate holdings. A routine review, technically, the kind that happened whenever a connected entity experienced significant reputational disruption. He'd asked for the review to be conducted thoroughly and according to standard protocol, and then moved on to other business. Gerald Park had conducted the review with the careful diligence of a man who understood that the request was routine and the context was not. And the review had found what it found, which was what Edward had known it would find because he knew his own portfolio. 11 points of indirect exposure, 2 of them significant enough to warrant extraction under standard risk management criteria. He'd signed off on the extraction. That was all. It was enough. When an entity the size of Sinclair Global moved its exposure, other entities noticed, the way weather fronts notice each other. 3 institutional investors had called Gerald within 24 hours. Gerald had said what could be said, which was that risk assessments were ongoing and positions were being managed, and by then the 11-minute video had 40 million views, and the investors had already done their own math. Victoria had not been in those conversations. She'd been in her own. The shareholder call, the acquisition reviews, the foundation board. She was aware of what was happening in the market in the way she was aware of most things that happened in proximity to Sinclair Global, which was completely, but she had not directed it, had not managed it, had not made a single phone call with intent to harm. What had happened to the Brooks family's business interests was the result of a video, a 4-sentence statement, a 32-minute interview, and the particular physics of reputation in a world where 50 million people could watch something happen in real time and form their own conclusions. What she felt about it, watching the collapse through Maya's updates, was still that complicated non-satisfaction. The awareness of consequence without the clean feeling that popular imagination attached to it. People online were calling it justice. They were using that word in her comments, in her mentions, in the emails that kept coming. She didn't argue with them. But she also didn't perform agreement because what justice felt like, in her actual body, was closer to grief than triumph. The Brooks family had destroyed something. The market had responded. Daniel had lost his job. An 8-year-old boy had lost some stability that he hadn't had enough of to spare. That was what the numbers represented underneath the corporate language. A kid who'd already lost his mother, sitting in a kitchen with a father who was trying to hold a life together with what he had left. She didn't let herself linger there too long. It wasn't her responsibility to absorb the consequences of Daniel's choices on his behalf. She knew that. She'd worked on knowing that. But she was also a person, not a verdict, and persons carry things whether or not the carrying is technically required of them. In the 3rd week of April, Maya appeared at Victoria's office door at 4:30 p.m. on a Wednesday with a specific expression. The one that meant there was something she wanted to say, but was deciding whether it was her place to say it. Victoria looked up from her laptop. Just say it. Daniel Brooks was seen at a career counseling center on Wabash this morning. Victoria held her expression. Maya, I'm not tracking him. It came up in a Google alert. Someone took a photo and posted it. It's been picked up by a couple of tabloid sites. Disgraced Brooks' son spotted job hunting. She said it with distaste. I thought you should know. Victoria sat with this. Thank you, she said, and meant the information and also the distaste. Maya left. Victoria looked out the window for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and looked at Daniel's contact. Still there, hadn't deleted it, wasn't sure what that signified. And she thought about the photo of him at a career counseling center being described as disgraced by people who had watched 11 minutes of a party and decided they understood the complete moral landscape of a human being. She didn't text him. But she thought about Marcus, and she thought about what it would be like to be 8 years old with a father who was trying hard in circumstances that had gotten complicated. And she thought about how the particular cruelty of public shaming was that it didn't cleanly land on the people who deserved it. It splashed. She called the Charity Foundation's office instead and confirmed her attendance at the fundraiser in 3 weeks. It wasn't penance. She just needed to do something that moved in a forward direction, and the fundraiser, transitional housing, families in crisis, felt like something she could put her hands on in a way that the other pieces of her life didn't right now. 2 weeks later, on a Friday evening when she would otherwise have been working late on a report that could have waited for Monday, she drove herself to the south side of Chicago and parked in the lot of a community center that the Sinclair Foundation had been partially funding for 3 years. The building needed a new roof, which was in the budget for next fiscal year. The parking lot had 2 potholes. The sign out front had 1 burnt-out letter. She went in. The fundraiser was modest, maybe 80 people, folding tables covered with paper tablecloths, a catered buffet from a local restaurant rather than a hotel kitchen. Nothing like the Grand Monarch, nothing meant to be. People in regular clothes, some of them representing the families the organization had helped, some of them donors, some of them volunteers who showed up every Saturday morning with tools and the willingness to be given instructions. Victoria walked in without an announcement, no security detail. She told them not to come. No Maya. Just her, in dark jeans and a jacket, holding a plate of buffet chicken at a folding table like everyone else. The executive director, a woman named Rosalind Ortega, who had been running this organization for 12 years on a budget that required constant creative management, found her within 5 minutes and didn't make a scene about it, which Victoria appreciated immediately. "Miss Sinclair," Rosalind said, shaking her hand. Practical grip, direct eye contact, a face that had the pleasant weathering of someone who spent more time outside than in. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me." Victoria looked around the room. "Tell me about the new site on Paulina." They talked for 20 minutes, actually talked, about pipe systems and load-bearing assessments and whether the second floor could support the family units they wanted to put up there. Rosalind knew her building. She knew her numbers. She talked about families with the specificity of someone who understood that housing was not abstract, that it was the 12-year-old who needed a bedroom to do homework in, the mother who needed a kitchen counter to make a lunch on, the father who needed an address to put on a job application. Victoria listened and asked questions and ate her buffet chicken and felt, for the first time in 4 weeks, like she was in a room where the conversation had nothing to do with the video or the brand or the trending phrases. It was a relief of a very particular kind. She was at the drink table, refilling a cup of water, when she heard a voice behind her that she didn't recognize. "You're her, aren't you?" She turned. A man, mid-30s, construction-worn hands, a jacket that had been good quality once and was now comfortable rather than presentable. He was looking at her without hostility or calculation, just the assessment of someone placing a face. "Depends on which her you mean," she said. He smiled at that. "The gala video. The yellow dress." "Yes," she said. "I'm her." He nodded. "My wife showed me that video. We were one of the families here. 2 years ago, the program put us in transitional housing for 7 months while I found work. My daughter spent 2nd grade in one of their units." He glanced around the room. "I volunteer on Saturdays now. Framework mostly and drywall." "That's good work," Victoria said. "Yeah." He looked at her steadily. "I just wanted to say, the interview you did, the bit about the way you treat people when you think they have nothing." He paused. "My daughter's teacher played that clip in class, as a conversation about character." Victoria felt something in her throat. "How old is your daughter?" 9. She nodded. She didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't a thing she could say that would be the right size for that information. "Tell her to keep paying attention," she said finally. He laughed. "She doesn't need encouragement. She pays attention to everything, already exhausting." He lifted his drink toward her in a small salute. "Night." He walked away. She stood at the drink table for a moment, the plastic cup of water in her hand, looking at the room full of people who were here because housing mattered, and families mattered, and the gap between having somewhere to live and not having somewhere to live was often smaller than anyone comfortable wanted to think about. She thought about the emails in her desk drawer, the woman in Memphis, the 19-year-old. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in a 2nd grade classroom watching a clip about character. The Brooks family had tried to make her small in that ballroom. They'd done it publicly and completely, and with phones filming every second of it. And the smallness had not stuck. Not because she was powerful, though she was, but because the room they'd tried to reduce her in front of had turned out to be larger than the Grand Monarch Hotel. It had turned out to be every room where someone like her had ever been looked at that way. Every person who had ever worn the wrong shoes to the wrong event and felt the temperature drop. The image that went out into the world was not the image Evelyn Brooks had intended. That was the part no amount of PR could manage. She stayed at the fundraiser until 9, helped stack chairs at the end, which Rosalind tried to wave her off from, and which Victoria ignored because she'd been sitting in office chairs for 5 weeks and needed to do something with her hands. She talked to 4 more people, a young mother with 2 toddlers and a plan, an older man who'd been building things for 40 years and had the forearms to prove it, a teenager volunteering what she understood to be mandatory community service hours who turned out to be unexpectedly interesting once you got past the mandatory. Driving home, Victoria felt the particular tiredness of having actually spent energy rather than just managed it. Her Lincoln Park apartment received her with the quiet that had felt lonely in the weeks immediately after the gala and felt, tonight, simply like hers. She made tea. She sat on the couch, not collapsing this time, deliberately, and picked up her phone. She looked at Daniel's contact for the second time in a week. Then she opened her messages and typed, "Marcus came to see me with his library card in his pocket as a prop. I thought you should know he's a good person. I think that's yours." She sent it before she could think about it too long. She set the phone down and drank her tea. His response came 4 minutes later. No words, just a single emoji. The one that means laughing while also crying, which she'd always thought was the most honest emoji ever invented because most things worth feeling weren't one thing cleanly. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone down and finished her tea and went to bed at an hour that wasn't embarrassingly early for once, and slept without waking up until her alarm, which felt like its own small progress. What she didn't know, couldn't have known that evening, was what was happening 45 minutes south of her apartment. Evelyn Brooks had gone to Daniel's place. Not called, not texted. Shown up, the way she did when she'd decided something and had made the calculation that presence was harder to dismiss than a voicemail. Daniel had opened the door and found his mother standing in the hallway of his building in a coat that was too good for the occasion, holding nothing, which was unusual because Evelyn Brooks always arrived with something. Wine, flowers, something that anchored the visit in the grammar of a gift and made turning her away require also turning away the object. She'd come with nothing. He'd let her in. Marcus was at a sleepover. The apartment was quiet. He made coffee he suspected neither of them wanted, and they sat at his kitchen table, which was the same kitchen table at which he'd found out he'd lost his job 2 weeks ago, a piece of furniture that was absorbing a lot of history lately. Evelyn looked at the table. "I'm not here with a speech," she said. "Okay," he said. "I've had 8 conversations with PR people in the last 3 weeks, and I'm very tired of talking in that register." He said nothing. He let her go where she was going. She looked up at him. Her face, his mother's face, the one that had been calibrated for as long as he could remember, into the expression that was appropriate for whatever room she was in, was not calibrated right now. It looked its age, which it didn't always, and it looked uncertain, which it almost never did. "I saw a 9-year-old's classroom," she said. He frowned slightly. "What?" There was a follow-up article. Someone had written about the interview Victoria gave, and there was a piece about how teachers were using it, in schools, as a lesson. Her jaw moved. A 9-year-old's classroom was watching a clip about character Daniel, and the reason they were watching it was because of what I did at that hotel. He sat with this. "I have been—" She stopped. Started again, and he could see the effort of it, could see the specific architecture of a woman who had been in command of her own presentation for 50 years, trying to take some of it down. "I have been trying to find the version of that evening where I was not wrong. I've been doing that for 3 weeks. My PR team helped me look for it. There isn't one." The kitchen was very quiet. "She loved you," Evelyn said. "I could see it. I saw it before I decided what I'd already decided, and I went ahead anyway." She looked at her coffee cup. "I wanted something specific for you, a specific kind of person, a specific kind of life, and I decided that wanting that was the same as knowing best." Her voice dropped slightly. "It isn't." Daniel looked at his mother for a long time. He thought about the 8-year-old version of himself learning to be very still when she entered rooms. He thought about 32-year-old him frozen in a ballroom. He thought about Marcus, who had taken a bus across the city in the morning with his library card in his pocket, who had not frozen, who had gone where the person needed him. "You need to say that to her," he said. "Not to me." Evelyn looked at him. She won't. I know she might not receive it. That's not the point. He kept his voice steady. The point is that she deserves to hear it from the person who did it, not through a PR statement, not in an article, from you. His mother was quiet for a long moment. I don't know if I can do that, she said. I know, Daniel said. I didn't know if I could do a lot of things either. Turns out, knowing if you can is less important than deciding you're going to. Evelyn looked at him. Really looked at him, in the way she rarely did, in the way that acknowledged he was an adult with his own weight and knowledge, and not just someone standing in her story. When did you get wise? She said, not mocking, just asking. I had a good teacher, he said. I didn't appreciate it properly at the time. She left an hour later. He stood at his window and watched her car pull away from his building, his mother's car with its particular careful progress through traffic, and he felt the exhaustion of the evening sitting in his chest alongside something that was complicated to name. Not forgiveness, not resolution, something less clean than either, the beginning of a process that would take considerably longer than one kitchen table conversation. His phone was on the counter. He picked it up and saw Victoria's message, the one about Marcus and the library card. He looked at it for a moment. Then he laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in 3 weeks, the kind that catches you off guard. He sent back the only emoji that was honest about what something made you feel when it made you feel more than one thing at once. He stood at his kitchen window for a while after, Marcus's library card still on the counter where his son had left it when he emptied his pockets before bed the previous night, and he thought about what it meant to be a person in the middle of your own wreckage. Not the end of it, not past it, just standing in the middle of it, trying to see which parts were structural and which were salvageable and which needed to just come down. The apartment was quiet. Outside, Chicago was moving through the end of April with the particular energy of a city that has survived another winter and is not quite over being relieved about it. He put Marcus's library card on the stack of school papers on the counter where it belonged. He went to bed. Neither of them had the shape of their future yet, and that was the truthful part. The part no story ever quite captures, the gap between the crisis and whatever comes after, which is not a montage and not a revelation, but just days, lived forward through the uncertainty, one at a time, by imperfect people trying to be less imperfect than they were yesterday. That was where they both were. And in some ways, it was the most honest place either of them had been in a very long time. The fundraiser on the South Side became a Saturday habit before Victoria fully registered that it had become one. It started practically. Rosalind Ortega had mentioned at the end of that first evening that the Paulina Street renovation was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks, and that volunteer coordination was their perpetual weak point. They had skilled people but no reliable system for deploying them, which meant Saturday mornings sometimes looked like 8 people standing around a job site waiting for someone to give direction. Victoria had said, without entirely thinking it through, that she could help with the logistics. She had run a $3 billion company's operational structure for 2 years. Coordinating a volunteer schedule for a renovation project was not a complex ask. What she hadn't accounted for was how much she would end up wanting to be there for reasons that had nothing to do with operational efficiency. The first Saturday, she'd shown up at 7 a.m. in work clothes, actual work clothes, jeans and boots and a jacket she didn't mind ruining, with a spreadsheet on her phone and a plan for rotating teams across 3 work areas. Rosalind had looked at the spreadsheet with the expression of someone encountering a degree of organization they'd previously only theorized existed and said simply, "You're not what I expected." "People keep saying that," Victoria said. "Is that a problem?" "Less than it used to be." By the 3rd Saturday, she knew the names of most of the regular volunteers. By the 5th, she knew which ones needed clear instructions and which ones needed to be left alone with a task. Which ones showed up with the right tools and which ones showed up with enthusiasm that had to be carefully directed away from load-bearing walls. She knew that a man named Pete was the person to go to for anything electrical, and that a woman named Carla brought coffee for 12 every week without being asked, and that a teenager named Jerome, who was completing court-mandated community service hours and had arrived the first day with the body language of someone serving a sentence, had by the 4th Saturday started showing up 15 minutes early. She knew these things the way you know them when you're present rather than managing from a distance, through proximity and repetition and the specific texture of shared work, which is different from most other kinds of knowing. She had not told most of them who she was. Rosalind knew. A few others had put it together over time, the way people do when a face that's been in the news appears in front of them repeatedly in a different context. Nobody made a production of it. That was what she'd found, which still surprised her even now. Ordinary people, on the whole, were considerably more interested in whether you showed up and whether you were useful than in your tax bracket. It was the 6th Saturday, mid-May, the weather finally committing to itself, the kind of morning where the air still had an edge but the light was unambiguous. When she first noticed Nathan Cole, she noticed him the way you notice competent people in a work context before you notice them in any other, by the absence of problems in the areas he was responsible for. She was in the front room going over progress notes with Pete when she became aware that the second-floor framing work, which had been a logistical headache for 2 weeks, was simply getting done. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just steadily, the way work gets done when the person doing it has done it enough times that the thinking and the doing have merged into something efficient. She went upstairs to check. He was working with 2 other volunteers, a college kid named Damon and a retired teacher named Harriet, who turned out to have unexpected construction aptitude. And he was explaining something about load distribution with the patient clarity of someone who genuinely didn't mind explaining things, which was a quality that was rarer than it should have been. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than gym logistics. And he had a quality of concentration that reminded her, oddly, of the way Marcus looked when he was reading about dinosaurs, fully in the thing. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "You're the coordinator," he said. Not a question. "Victoria," she said. "Nathan." He looked around the room, then back at her. The support beam placement on the south wall was off by about 2 inches from the original plan. I adjusted it. It'll hold better this way. I can show you why if you want. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He had a way of explaining structural things, load paths, stress distribution, the logic of why a building stood up. That made them comprehensible without being condescending, the vocabulary of someone who'd been doing this long enough that the knowledge had become native rather than acquired. She followed it. She asked 2 questions. He answered both without looking at her differently for asking them, which was more unusual than it ought to be. "How long have you been volunteering here?" she asked. "About 8 months. He picked up a nail gun. "Saturdays mostly. Sometimes Sundays if there's a tight deadline." "What do you do during the week?" "Construction engineering, project management, mostly." He positioned a bracket against the framing and drove 2 nails into it with the efficiency of someone for whom this was not a performance. "I work for a firm in the West Loop." She stood there for a moment watching him work, and then went back downstairs to her spreadsheet. She did not think about him particularly for the rest of that morning, or told herself she didn't. The thing was, she'd gotten better in the past 6 weeks at recognizing the difference between what she was thinking and what she was telling herself she was thinking. It was imprecise progress. She still caught herself mid-rationalization regularly, but the gap between the two had narrowed. The work on that particular internal project had started in her father's kitchen in March and continued in ways that didn't look like progress from the outside but felt, incrementally, like it. She'd been in contact with Daniel, sporadically, carefully, in the register of 2 people who were being honest with each other about the current limits of what was possible. He was in therapy, had mentioned this in a text with the slightly self-conscious brevity of a man who wanted her to know but wasn't sure how to frame the information. She'd said that was good and meant it. She'd asked about Marcus once, and he'd sent her a voice memo of Marcus explaining, at length and with genuine outrage, that a nature documentary had incorrectly identified a mosasaurus as a plesiosaur, and that someone needed to be held accountable for this. She'd listened to the voice memo 3 times. She and Daniel were not reconciling. She wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, except being honest in a way they hadn't always managed when they'd been together, which was something. Maybe that was its own category, she'd decided. The thing that came after a relationship but wasn't nothing. When there were real feelings and real accountability and real wreckage that neither of them was pretending wasn't there. It was not a tidy category. She didn't need it to be tidy. The second time she had a real conversation with Nathan Cole was the following Saturday. When the coffee situation had broken down, Carla was out sick, nobody else had organized it, and by 9 a.m. there were 12 volunteers who needed something hot and no system for providing it. Victoria drove to the nearest coffee place and came back with 2 carriers of drip and a bag of pastries that cost more than the coffee, which was impractical but turned out to be the right call because Harriet had brought a first-time volunteer who was 17 and hadn't eaten breakfast and looked at the pastries like they were personally addressed to her. Nathan was at her car before she'd fully processed how to carry everything. "Here," he said, taking 1 carrier without asking, which she appreciated because the alternative was a conversation about whether she needed help. They walked back to the building together. He held the door. She thanked him. "You drove yourself," he said, glancing at her car. "I'm capable of that." "I know. I'm just—" "Rosalind mentioned you usually have someone who does the coordination logistics, your assistant or something." "Maya couldn't make it today." She set the coffee down on the makeshift supply table. "I'm still capable of driving a car without her." He almost smiled. "I didn't say you weren't. Your tone implied it." "My tone implied I was making an observation, which you correctly identified as an observation." He started pulling cups out of the paper bag with the same economy of motion he applied to everything. "Here's another one. You've been here 6 weeks and most of the volunteers still don't know who you are. Rosalind told me, which is how I know. She trusts me with information like that." Victoria looked at him. And nothing." He handed her a cup of coffee. "I was just acknowledging that I know, in case it's useful to know that someone knows." She held the cup. "Does it change anything? For you? Should it?" Most people would say no and then behave differently. He seemed to think about this. "I've been on job sites with a lot of different kinds of people," he said finally. "I've worked with guys who've been in prison and guys who've been in boardrooms and guys who are trying to figure out which they're headed toward. What I care about on a job site is whether someone's paying attention and whether they're honest about what they don't know. That's it." He picked up his own coffee. "By that standard, you're fine." "High praise," she said. "It's the only praise that means anything." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in his manner, the directness of it, the absence of performance, that reminded her of what she'd been looking for when she'd moved to Lincoln Park. Not the same as Daniel, which was an important distinction, but adjacent to the same quality. The quality of someone who hadn't decided in advance what the conversation was supposed to produce. "I'll take it," she said, and went to coordinate the morning's work schedule. May became June in the particular way Chicago seasons became each other. Not gradually, but in lurches. A cold week, then suddenly and completely warm, as if the city had been having an internal debate and finally committed. The Paulina Street building was taking shape. The second floor had its framing and its drywall, and 2 of its 6 family units had their interiors roughed in. Rosalind had a waiting list of 12 families. 12 families who would have an address and a kitchen counter and a bedroom door that closed and a window with actual light coming through it, because a group of people showed up on Saturday mornings with tools. Victoria thought about that waiting list on the drive home some Saturdays. The names on it weren't abstract to her anymore. Rosalind had introduced her to 3 of the families over the past month. Not because it was required, but because Rosalind understood that the distance between funder and funded was not neutral, that it had its own kind of distortion, and that showing people what they were actually building was one way of closing it. One of the families was a mother named Sandra and her 2 daughters, 11 and 7, currently in a temporary shelter downtown. The 11-year-old had brought a book to the meeting, a middle-grade novel with a cracked spine and a bookmark near the end, and held it through the entire conversation while her mother answered Rosalind's questions about the unit size they needed and the school district they were hoping to stay in. She hadn't read the book during the meeting. She'd just held it. The way kids hold things when they need something to anchor to. Victoria had thought about Marcus holding his dinosaur backpack strap in that coffee shop in October. She'd thought about the specific objects children choose as ballast when the adult world around them is uncertain. She'd gone home that evening and called the shelter directly and arranged through the foundation in a way that wasn't attached to her name for the family to be moved to the top of the Paulina Street waiting list. She'd also sent a book, 3 books actually, a continuation of whatever series the 11-year-old was reading, identified through the cover visible in a photo Rosalind had sent, through the foundation's administrative office. She did not tell anyone she'd done this. It was not a gesture that required an audience. Nathan saw her on the phone with the shelter, though he didn't know who she was calling, and he noticed because he noticed things without making a production of noticing them. That was something she'd registered over 6 weeks of Saturday mornings. He was the kind of person who paid attention quietly, who cataloged the world without performing the cataloging. She'd found herself looking forward to Saturday mornings in a way that surprised her, because it wasn't about the work exactly, though the work was satisfying in a concrete way that most of her week wasn't. It was about the quality of the hours, the specific texture of time that passed when you were in the middle of something with other people, not managing it from above, but in the middle of it, where the problems were real and physical, and the solutions were also real and physical, and you could stand at the end of a Saturday and look at something that was more finished than it had been when you arrived. She hadn't had enough hours that felt like that. The conversation that changed things between her and Nathan happened on a Saturday in the second week of June at the end of the morning. Most of the volunteers had left. She was doing a walkthrough of the third unit with a checklist, and he was finishing something on the window framing in the corner. "Your daughter," she said, not looking up from her checklist. She'd heard him mention her to Damon 2 weeks ago, a specific anecdote about a parent-teacher conference, and the information had lodged without her intending it to. "How old is she?" He looked up from the window. 7. She'll be 8 in September. "What's her name?" "Lily." Victoria made a note on her checklist. "She come to job sites with you?" "Sometimes. On holidays when school's out, if the site is safe enough." He paused. "She mostly wants to talk to whoever will listen. Her current audience is whoever's willing to hear about the plot of whatever book she's reading." Victoria lowered her checklist and looked at him. "Where's her mother?" She asked it directly because she'd found over 6 weeks that directness was the register Nathan responded to best, that he didn't require conversational softening, that he found it mildly inefficient. He looked at her with the same directness back. "She died," he said, 4 years ago. "Aneurysm. Very fast. No warning." Victoria held his gaze. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." He said it without the reflexive flinching that people sometimes had around the phrase, the discomfort with being condoled. He'd had 4 years to develop a relationship with his own grief, she understood. Not past it, people were rarely past it, but with a working arrangement. "So it's been you and Lily," she said. "Me and Lily." He looked at the window frame. "And whoever shows up on Saturday mornings and is willing to talk to a 7-year-old about plot." She wrote something on her checklist that she didn't need to write, just to give her hand something to do. "She sounds like someone I know," she said. He looked at her. "Who?" "A kid I used to know." She capped her pen. "He knows a lot about dinosaurs." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and she understood that he understood she'd closed something there, offered the edge of something, and pulled it back, and he respected the boundary of it without making her explain it. "Most kids find their thing," he said. "Lily's thing is stories. She retells them for days after she finishes a book. I know the plot of about 40 novels I haven't read." "Is that annoying?" He considered this with the genuine honesty she'd come to expect from him. "Sometimes. But it's also, she processes the world through narrative. She needs to tell the story to understand what it meant. I figure that's not a bad way to be wired." Victoria thought about this. "No," she said. "It's not." They finished the walkthrough together, which she hadn't planned, and she drove home with the windows down because June in Chicago deserved it, and she thought about the specific quality of that conversation. Nothing had been said that was particularly unusual. No revelations, no dramatic moments, just 2 adults talking with their actual voices in a room that was becoming something useful. She'd forgotten how rare that was. The following Saturday, Lily was there. She'd been brought because school was out for a teacher professional day and the babysitter had fallen through, which Nathan explained to Victoria with the slight self-consciousness of a parent introducing a variable that wasn't in the original plan. Lily was small and dark-haired and had the contained energy of a child who'd spent time around adult workspaces and understood the rules without having to be told twice. She was carrying a book. Victoria noticed this immediately, a chapter book with a dragon on the cover. And she found a spot in the finished first-floor unit where she'd be out of the way and opened it. She lasted 11 minutes before she came to find Victoria. "You're the coordinator," Lily said, appearing beside Victoria's clipboard. "That's me." "What does a coordinator do?" "Make sure everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing." Lily seemed to find this professionally respectable. "I coordinate my dad sometimes," she said. "He forgets to eat lunch." "That sounds like useful work." "He thinks so too." She looked at the clipboard. What's all that? Victoria showed her the floor plan and the checklist and explained, in terms she calibrated for a 7-year-old without talking down to her, what the building was going to be. Lily listened with the full attention quality that some children had, and most adults lost somewhere in their 20s. Families will live here? She said. Yes. Do they have a place to live now? Some of them are in shelters. Some of them are staying with relatives. Victoria looked at the floor plan. This will be their own. Lily thought about this. That's good, she said, with the simplicity of a child making an unambiguous moral assessment. Then, my dad built stuff like this before. He has pictures of different buildings. He's very good at it. I know. She said it without boasting, just factual. He's good at most things, except lunch. Victoria looked at this child, 7 years old, carrying a dragon book, explaining her father's professional competencies and nutritional failures with equal authority, and felt the specific warmth of someone who'd spent enough time around Marcus Brooks to recognize the particular species of kid she was in the presence of. Not the same. Different wiring, different interests, but the same quality of inhabiting themselves completely, without apology, without performance. She thought of what Nathan had said. She's wired to tell stories to understand what they meant. She thought, I understand that. What are you reading? Victoria asked. Lily showed her the cover. She described the plot with a level of detail and investment that made the 11-minute read she'd managed that morning feel like it had been a significant event in her relationship with the text. Victoria listened and asked one question about the dragon's motivation, and Lily launched into an analysis that had real thoughtfulness in it, the kind that surprised you because you'd underestimated what a 7-year-old could track. Nathan appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, looking for his daughter with the specific expression of a father who's been listening to the silence and determining whether it's the good kind. He found her cross-legged on the floor next to Victoria, both of them looking at the Dragon Book's cover art, while Lily explained what she thought was going to happen in the last 3 chapters and why. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Victoria looked up and caught his eye. She didn't know what her expression was doing. Whatever it was, he looked at it for a moment and then looked at his daughter, and something in his face did the quiet thing that faces do when they're registering something that matters. Lunch, he said to Lily. I know, Lily said, not looking up. You forget, but I don't. He laughed, and it was the real kind, and Victoria looked at the floor plan in her hand so she wasn't watching him too obviously. They ate lunch on the front steps. She'd brought sandwiches for the volunteers, another habit that had accrued without her planning it, and there were 3 left over. Nathan and Lily sat on the steps and ate, and Victoria sat 2 steps up, eating hers, and Lily told them both about Chapter 12 with the focused intensity of someone for whom the distinction between eating and narrating was unnecessary. The afternoon light was good on the street. The building behind them was becoming what it was supposed to be. Somewhere inside, Pete was doing something with electrical that would give 12 families working outlets, and Harriet was painting a hallway the color Rosalind had picked, which was a warm yellow that somehow managed not to be institutional. Victoria sat on the steps and listened to a 7-year-old explain dragon politics, and ate half a turkey sandwich and let the afternoon be what it was without trying to define it. This is the part of the story that doesn't photograph well, the part that doesn't have an event, a confrontation, a reveal. Just an ordinary Saturday in June on the steps of a building that smelled like fresh drywall, with a 7-year-old who processed the world through narrative and a man who noticed things without performing the noticing, and a woman who had spent a significant portion of her adult life trying to find a room that was just hers and was starting to understand that rooms were less the point than she'd thought. But the story wasn't there yet. That needed to be said plainly, because the temptation to rush the telling is real, to skip the actual distance between that afternoon on the steps and anything that might resemble resolution. Victoria was 30 years old, and she was still carrying the specific weight of the Grand Monarch Hotel, which had not become lighter just because 6 weeks had passed, and her posture had been referenced in a classroom. She was still waking up some nights with the precise memory of standing in that ballroom waiting for Daniel to say her name. She was still figuring out what trust looked like when you'd built something careful and watched it collapse. Those were not small things. They did not resolve on a timeline she could coordinate. Nathan, for his part, was a man who had learned, over 4 years of single parenthood and grief, and the slow reconstruction of a life that hadn't been planned to be reconstructed, that attachment was its own kind of risk. Not a reason not to do it. He was not a closed person, had not let himself become one, because Lily needed a father who knew how to be present rather than one who'd calcified around a loss. But he was also careful in the way that people become careful when they've understood, in the most direct possible way, that the people you love are temporary. Not as a philosophy, but as a fact they'd lived through on a Tuesday morning when a phone call had changed the entire architecture of his future. He noticed Victoria Sinclair the way you notice something that doesn't fit the simple categories you've been using to organize your world. Not disruptive, just requiring a different kind of attention. He noticed the gap between who she was in theory and who she was on a Saturday morning with a clipboard and a turkey sandwich. He noticed that his daughter had sat with her for 20 minutes without prompting, which was not nothing, because Lily was discerning about adults in the way children were when they'd been raised by someone who treated them as a full person rather than a managed responsibility. He did not do anything about this noticing because it was the second week of June and they'd had approximately 11 real conversations, and he was not a person who moved on impressions rather than knowledge. But he noticed. And Victoria, driving home that Saturday evening with the windows down and Lily's Dragon book summary still in her head, thought about the particular quality of the afternoon. Not the romance of it, because she was too honest with herself for that framing, but the quality of it. The ease, the absence of management, the specific feeling of being in a room or on a set of steps where she was not being calculated. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Lily and her dragon politics and her father's forgotten lunches. She thought about how the things you end up needing are rarely the things you went looking for, and how they arrive in the middle of ordinary Saturdays without announcement, in the form of a 7-year-old explaining Chapter 12. She didn't call anyone when she got home. She made dinner. Real dinner, not something from a delivery app, because she'd gotten back into the habit of cooking for herself, which was its own small signal about the state of things. She ate it at her table instead of at her desk. She read for an hour. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. She was not healed. That word had never quite fit the thing she was working on. But she was building, maybe. The way buildings get built on Saturday mornings by people who show up and do the work and go home and come back the following week. Not finished, not close to finished, but further along than she'd been. The Paulina Street building's first unit was completed on the last Saturday of June. Rosalind had scheduled a small walkthrough with Sandra and her 2 daughters. The family Victoria had moved to the top of the waiting list, and the volunteers who'd worked on it had gathered in the front room to, not celebrate exactly, just be present when the door opened. Sandra walked in first. She stood in the small entry and looked at the clean floors and the painted walls and the window that let in the afternoon light, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Her 11-year-old came in behind her and stood beside her, and the 7-year-old pushed past them both to see the bedroom, which had a closet with a real door that closed, and said from somewhere inside it, "Mom, there's a closet." Like the closet was the thing. Like the closet was evidence of something she'd needed to verify existed. Sandra put her hand over her mouth. Victoria was standing at the back of the room. She wasn't crying. She did not allow herself to cry in rooms full of people if she could avoid it, which was probably a character flaw but was also just the truth. But she felt it. The weight of what the room represented, the distance between having no address and having this one, the closet that the 7-year-old had needed to verify, the book in the 11-year-old's hands as she came through the door. She felt a hand, brief, just a moment, on her arm. She looked. Nathan. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Sandra in the center of the room. The touch was not a statement. It was just acknowledgement. A person next to another person at the same moment, in the same room, registering the same thing. She didn't move away from it. After a while, the touch was gone, and they were just 2 people standing in a room that was finished, watching a family understand that the room was theirs. The second unit on Paulina Street was finished in the 3rd week of July, and the 3rd a week after that, and by the time August arrived with its particular Chicago weight, the heat that sat in the city like something that had been there all year and finally stopped pretending otherwise, 4 of the 6 units were occupied and the remaining 2 were within 2 Saturdays of being ready. Victoria had not planned to be this invested in a building. She'd also not planned to know the names of every family on the waiting list, or to have developed opinions about load-bearing wall placement, or to have spent 3 separate evenings at her kitchen table reviewing Rosalind's operational budget and identifying 3 line items that could be restructured without touching program delivery. She hadn't planned any of it, which was, she'd decided, probably why it had happened at all. The things she planned tended to be things she could manage from a distance. The things she didn't plan had a way of getting inside the actual perimeter. Lily had taken to calling her Victoria, which was the name she'd introduced herself with on that first Saturday, and to treating her as a reliable feature of the Saturday landscape in the way that children incorporate new adults into their world when the new adult has proven consistent. Consistency mattered to Lily in a way that Nathan had explained once, briefly, as a consequence of loss. When the fundamental structure of a child's world has been interrupted once without warning, reliability becomes something they track carefully. Not anxiously, necessarily, just carefully. Victoria understood this. She showed up every Saturday without announcing in advance that she would, because showing up without the announcement was what made it real rather than promised. She'd thought about that distinction more than once. The difference between announcing and doing, between promising and being present. She thought about it in relationship to things other than Saturdays, too. But she was working on not pulling every thread back to the same knot before it was time. Nathan had asked her to dinner in July, at the end of a Saturday, when the 4th unit had been finished and Rosalind had produced an unexpected bottle of wine from somewhere in her office, and everyone had stood around drinking out of paper cups and being quietly pleased with themselves. He'd waited until most people had left, and then asked in the same direct register he used for everything, without preamble or performance. "Would you want to have dinner sometime? Not here. Somewhere with actual plates." She'd looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I would." They'd gone the following Thursday to a restaurant in Logan Square that was not fancy and not trying to be, with exposed brick and a menu that changed weekly and a noise level that required you to actually pay attention to the person across from you. She'd driven herself. He'd driven himself. They'd met at the door, which she'd appreciated for reasons she didn't need to explain and he hadn't required her to. The dinner had not been a revelation. It had been better than that. It had been easy. Not the kind of easy that happens when 2 people are performing comfort at each other, but the kind that happens when the conversation doesn't need to be managed, because both people are actually saying what they think. He'd asked about her company, directly, because he was not a person who pretended things he knew were unknown. She talked about it the way she talked about it when she was being honest rather than professional. The parts that were genuinely interesting to her, the parts that were exhausting, the specific quality of inheriting something that her grandfather had built from almost nothing, and that now moved markets when it made decisions, and the weight of that, which was not a complaint, but was also not nothing. He'd listened without the particular expression that people sometimes had when she talked about the company, the recalibrating look, the assessment revision look, the look that meant they were now seeing her differently because the number was in the room. He'd looked at her the same way he'd looked at her when she was explaining volunteer schedules. She'd asked about his work too, and meant the question, and he'd talked about construction engineering with the ease of someone who'd made peace with the gap between what their job was called and how interesting it actually was. He talked about the physics of how things stood up, the problem solving of it, the specific satisfaction of a structure that was correctly load distributed, and she'd listened and found she was genuinely interested, which was not something she'd predicted in advance about the physics of buildings, and was one of the small revelations the evening had produced. They'd talked about Lily. They'd talked about Marcus briefly, and he'd asked a question or two without pushing, and she'd answered the ones she was ready to answer, and he hadn't pressed on the ones she wasn't. Near the end of the evening, he'd said something she'd thought about since. "I'm not in a hurry. I want you to know that. I'm not coming into this with a timeline." She'd looked at him across the table. Most people have a timeline even when they say they don't. "I had a wife who died on a Tuesday morning when everything was fine," he said. "I don't make timelines about things I actually care about anymore. They're useful for construction projects. That's about it." She'd thought about that on the drive home, about what it meant to have had your planning instinct broken by loss and to have rebuilt it differently, with looser architecture, more tolerance for the structure being incomplete for longer. She was still learning that skill herself. The dinner had become a second dinner and then a habit, the way the Saturdays had become a habit, through repetition and the absence of a reason to stop. They didn't put a name on what it was. They didn't talk about what it was becoming or what they wanted it to become. They just showed up. Both of them, separately deciding to keep doing the thing that felt worth doing. Lily had asked Victoria on a Saturday in August, sitting on the steps of the Paulina Street building, eating the sandwiches that Victoria had started bringing without being asked, "Do you like my dad?" Victoria had not been surprised by the question. She'd expected it in some form. Lily tracked people with the story logic of a child who understood that characters had relationships and relationships had stakes. "Yes," she said. "Very much." Lily had considered this with the serious face she wore when she was assessing something. "He likes you too," she said. "He smiles differently when you're here." "How so?" "Like he's not reminding himself to." She'd taken a bite of her sandwich. "He does that sometimes. Reminds himself." "I can tell." Victoria had looked at this 7-year-old child who told stories to understand what they meant, and tracked her father's genuine versus performed happiness, and she'd thought, Nathan built this, not alone, not without the loss that had shaped it too, but this specific child who paid this specific kind of attention was the product of someone who had stayed present. When staying present cost something. She'd thought about the kind of person it took to do that. She'd eaten the rest of her sandwich and not said anything, because some things didn't need words added to them. What she hadn't expected was Evelyn Brooks. The call came in the last week of August, on a Wednesday morning when Victoria was between meetings, her phone on her desk face up for once because she was waiting for a document from legal. The name on the screen stopped her for a moment. She'd kept the contact, which she wasn't sure what it said about her, possibly just that she didn't delete things impulsively. She answered it. "Victoria." Evelyn's voice was different from the last time she'd heard it, which had been across a ballroom. Not diminished. Evelyn Brooks had not been diminished, Victoria could hear that, but altered. The particular quality of someone who had spent months arriving at something and was now standing in front of it. "Evelyn," Victoria said. A brief pause. "I've been trying to find the right time to make this call for 4 months. I've decided there isn't one, so I'm making it now." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "Okay. I'm not going to ask for anything. I don't want anything from you. I'm not calling because my PR team thinks it will help, and I'm not calling because Daniel asked me to." Another pause, and Victoria could hear the effort in it. "I'm calling because what I did to you in that hotel was wrong. Entirely wrong. And I want you to hear that directly from me, not in a statement, not through someone else. I owe you that, at minimum." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "The dress comment?" Evelyn continued, and there was something in her voice now that was, if not quite raw, the closest to it that a woman like Evelyn was likely to get. "The things I said. I looked at you and I decided who you were before you'd said 10 words. I decided what category you fit, and I made sure everyone in that room knew which category I'd put you in, and She stopped. "I hit you. I'm still not..." There's no version of my reasoning that night that gets me anywhere near that being acceptable. Victoria held the phone. She'd thought about this conversation, had imagined various forms of it in the months since March, in the way you rehearse things that may or may not happen, assigning dialogue to people based on your best estimate of their character. The version she'd imagined for Evelyn had always landed somewhere between defensive and performative, because that had been the only register she'd seen from her. The curated version, the version managed for an audience. This didn't sound like that. This sounded like a woman in her late 50s who had spent 4 months looking at herself in a mirror she hadn't chosen to stand in front of and finding the reflection difficult to argue with. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yes." "Why did you decide what you decided, before I said 10 words? What was the thing that made you look at me and know?" A long silence. "The dress," Evelyn said finally. "The shoes, the absence of the things I looked for, the signals I'd learned to use to categorize people." Her voice had something in it that might have been shame, the real kind that doesn't announce itself. "I'd been doing it for so long that I didn't notice I was doing it. I just processed the information and reached the conclusion and treated the conclusion as fact." A pause. "What I didn't allow for was that someone might choose to be without those signals, that the absence might be deliberate, that it might mean something entirely different from what I assumed." Victoria thought about the yellow dress on the back of her door in March, the choice of it, what she'd been testing, and why. "I don't know if this means anything to you," Evelyn said. "I don't have a right to ask you for anything. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did, specifically, not generally. I understand the specific thing, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life convincing myself it was something other than what it was. Victoria looked at the ceiling of her office for a moment. It means something, she said. I'm not ready to have a different conversation than this one, but this one, I hear you. Evelyn let out a breath. Thank you, she said. That's more than I had any right to expect. They said goodbye. Victoria put her phone face down on her desk and sat in her chair and looked at the wall for a while. Legal's document arrived, and she didn't open it immediately. She sat with the texture of the conversation and thought about what it cost to make a call like that. The specific courage of reaching out to someone you'd wronged without any guarantee of what you'd receive, without the management of the outcome. She'd underestimated Evelyn Brooks's capacity for it. That was its own kind of information. She thought about what she'd said to Priya Chakraborty in February. Character, not circumstance. She'd meant it as a standard for how people treated others. She was realizing, sitting in her office in August, that it was also a standard for how people reckoned with themselves. Character was not just how you acted under pressure. It was also what you did when the pressure had passed, and the cameras were off, and there was no one watching to give you credit for the reckoning. Evelyn had called with no cameras and no audience and no benefit. Victoria was not ready to call that forgiveness. She didn't know if she'd ever use that word, but she knew the difference between someone who had genuinely looked at themselves and someone who was performing the looking, and Evelyn, whatever else she was, had been doing the real thing. That mattered. She let it matter. She opened Legal's document. The charity gala that Sinclair Foundation had been planning since May was scheduled for the last Friday of September, at a venue that was not the Grand Monarch Hotel and had been specifically chosen for not being the Grand Monarch Hotel, a fact that Victoria had not mentioned to anyone but that Maya had understood without comment. It was a converted warehouse in the West Loop that the foundation had used twice before. Good acoustics, flexible space, the kind of place that could hold 300 people without making them feel warehoused. It was the foundation's annual benefit, which raised money for the housing programs that included Paulina Street. Victoria was chairing it this year, which she did every other year, in rotation with her father and 2 board members. She hadn't chaired it since the gala at the Grand Monarch, which had not been lost on anyone in the planning meetings, but which nobody had said directly, because the people in those planning meetings were professionals. 2 weeks before the event, Maya appeared at her office door with the volunteer list and a slightly careful expression. "What?" Victoria said. "Nathan Cole is on the volunteer list. He signed up through Rosalind's network." Victoria looked at her. "And?" "Nothing." Maya set the list on her desk. "I thought you should know." "Maya, I'm aware of who he is." "I know you are." She turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, the 3 times I've seen him at Paulina Street, he struck me as someone who doesn't require a lot of managing." Victoria looked at the list. "I know that too." "Good." Maya left. She looked at Nathan's name on the list and thought about what the evening would be. Her world, the one with her name on the door, the chandeliers and the guest list and the event photography and 300 people who knew exactly who Victoria Sinclair was and what her family name attached to. It was the inverse of the Grand Monarch, in a way. Then, she'd been in the wrong room, in the wrong dress. Now, he would be in her room, in her version of the event, and the question was not whether he'd be assessed by the room, but what he thought of rooms that assessed people. She already knew the answer. She'd watched him on 12 Saturdays. She knew what he thought of rooms that assessed people. She called him that evening. "The Foundation Gala," she said when he picked up. "You signed up to volunteer." "I did." "Rosalind mentioned it, said they needed people for setup and teardown. I'm usually free on Fridays." "It's my event," she said. "The foundation is mine. It'll be a formal event, 300 people, most of them connected to the Sinclair name in some way. Press coverage, the whole situation." A pause. "Are you telling me so I can decide whether I want to come?" "I'm telling you so you know what you're walking into." Victoria. His voice had the tone it got when she was being more complicated than the situation required. "I'll be there to carry tables. I know who you are. I've known who you are since the 2nd week of June." "I know." "Then what are you actually asking?" She thought about it. "I want you there," she said. "Not just as a volunteer. I want you and Lily there, as my guests." A longer pause this time. Lily won't have anyone to talk to about dragons, he said. Lily will have me. He was quiet for a moment, then, okay, we'll be there. She hung up and stood at her window, watching the city in the early September dark, and felt the particular vulnerability of having said a thing clearly instead of sideways. She'd gotten better at it. It still felt like stepping off a ledge every time. She suspected it always would. The night of the gala, she arrived early, as she always did for events she chaired, an hour before doors, working the room in the opposite direction of what people expected, checking logistics instead of receiving guests. The converted warehouse had been transformed. Warm light, round tables, the foundation's work displayed on large prints along the walls, before and after photographs of buildings like Paulina Street, families like Sandra's, the 11-year-old with the cracked spine book now photographed in a bedroom with a real door. Rosalind was there early too, in a dress that was clearly new and that she wore with the slight self-consciousness of someone who was more comfortable in work clothes. They stood together for a moment looking at the photographs. The Paulina Street project is fully occupied, Rosalind said. I know. Victoria had gotten the message from Maya that morning. All 6 units, and we've broken ground on the Washtenaw site. I saw the permit approval. Rosalind looked at her. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've had a lot of donors. Most of them give money, and sometimes they give time, but there's usually a distance. She looked back at the photographs. You're the first one who showed up and stacked chairs. Victoria thought about the yellow dress, about Lincoln Park, about what happened when you decided to just be in the room instead of above it. It was good for me, she said. Not just for the project. I know, Rosalind said. That's the thing about showing up. It's usually good for both sides. Edward Sinclair arrived at 6:30, which was 15 minutes before doors, and found his daughter near the entrance checking something on her phone. He looked good, rested in the way that summer had given him, and wearing a suit that suggested he'd actually thought about the occasion rather than treating it as one more thing in the calendar. The Washtenaw site, he said, by way of greeting. I know. Good news. Good news. He stood beside her. You look well. I feel well, she said, and meant it more straightforwardly than she would have in March. He looked around the space, the photographs, the tables, the work that the foundation represented. He'd chaired this event 4 times himself, and had always done it from a position of command, which was the only position he knew. Watching Victoria in the room, he saw something different, someone who was present in it rather than over it. Maya tells me Nathan Cole is attending tonight, he said. Victoria looked at her father. Maya talks too much. Maya gives me relevant information. He adjusted his cufflink. What should I know about him? He's a construction engineer, widower, single father to a 7-year-old named Lily, who will tell you everything about the book she's currently reading, whether you ask or not. She looked at her father. He's a decent person. That's what you need to know. Edward was quiet for a moment. Is he someone I'll be seeing more of? I think so, yes. Her father nodded in the way he processed information he'd already partially anticipated. All right, he said. That's it? All right? What do you want me to say? I don't know, something more. He looked at her. You're happy, he said simply. That's not a small thing. I'm not going to complicate it with questions. She looked at her father, 62 years old, built from the same material as his father before him, a man who communicated best through action and who had taken off his jacket in a ballroom in March and put it around his daughter's shoulders in front of 500 people and said 3 words that reordered a room. Who had held her hand briefly in the back of a car and asked, and received an honest answer. Thank you, she said, for March. He looked faintly uncomfortable with the directness of it, which was his way. You would have walked out regardless, he said. Maybe, but I didn't have to do it alone. He said nothing, but his expression did the thing it did sometimes, the thing that was the Edward Sinclair equivalent of everything he couldn't quite put into words, which was almost everything that mattered. Doors opened at 7. Nathan arrived at 7:15, Lily beside him in a dress that had been clearly chosen by a 7-year-old because it had a cape attached to the back, which Victoria registered immediately and which she found so correct that she couldn't speak for a moment. He was in a suit that fit him the way suits fit people who don't wear them constantly. Slightly unusual, entirely acceptable, himself inside it rather than the suit wearing him. He looked at the room and then at her, and the look he gave her was the one Lily had described, the one that wasn't reminded into existing. "Nice venue," he said. "Thank you, I had help." He looked at the photographs on the wall. Paulina Street. Unit 3 is Sandra's. Second photograph from the left. He found it, stood looking at it for a moment. "We did good work," he said. "We did." Lily tugged Victoria's hand. "There's a girl my age over there," she said, pointing with the authority of someone who had identified a social opportunity and intended to pursue it. "Can I go talk to her?" "Go ahead," Victoria said. She watched Lily cross the room with her dragon book confidence and her cape, and she thought about a 7-year-old in a shelter bedroom holding a library book and a closet door. And she thought about the 11-year-old who now had a real room. And she thought about the distance between those two things and what it took to close it. Nathan was watching Lily too. "She asked me this morning if you'd be her friend," he said. She meant it as a question about the ongoing arrangement. She wanted clarity. Victoria looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was pretty sure yes, but she should ask herself." He put his hands in his pockets. "She was going to ask you tonight, but apparently the girl with the red shoes is a more pressing matter." "Tell her the answer is yes," Victoria said. "She doesn't need to ask." The gala moved through its evening. Dinner, the foundation's presentation, remarks from Rosalind that were clear and specific and not dressed up in the language of charity events that usually iron the human beings out of the cause. Victoria gave a short speech, which she'd written herself without communications help, which Maya had noted without comment. She talked about Paulina Street. She talked about Sandra and her daughters and the closet door. She did not talk about the Grand Monarch Hotel, because this evening was not about that. It was about what came after. Not the vindication of it, not the trending phrases, but the actual forward direction she'd moved in while the internet was looking at the past. She said near the end, "I've spent a lot of my life in rooms where the evaluation happened before the conversation, where people decided what something was worth before they knew what it was. I think most of us have been in rooms like that, on one side or the other of that assessment." She paused. "The only answer I've found, for what it's worth, is to keep showing up. Not louder, not with better credentials, just present. In the actual room, doing the actual thing. That's it. That's the whole strategy." 300 people applauded. She stepped back from the microphone and found her father in the audience, who gave her the small, precise nod he reserved for things he genuinely approved of. She found Nathan next, who was at a table near the back. He looked at her and didn't applaud specifically, just held her gaze for a moment with an expression that said, "I heard you." That was true, which was worth more to her than the 300 pairs of hands. Lily had found her again by 10 p.m., the red shoes girl absorbed into the general evening somewhere, and was telling Victoria about the final chapters of the Dragon Book. She'd finished it on the car ride over and had a great deal to say. Victoria sat on a chair near the wall and listened with the full attention that Lily deserved, and Nathan sat in the chair beside her without performing the sitting, just there, the way he was there on Saturdays, comfortable in the fact of being next to someone rather than needing the nearness to be a statement. The evening wound down the way good evenings do. Slowly, without urgency, the way you linger in a place that's been good to you. Daniel Brooks watched a short clip of the gala on his phone, sitting in his apartment at 11 p.m. Someone had posted a 10-second video to social media, Victoria at the microphone, the last few words of her speech. He'd watched it twice without meaning to. He was different now than he'd been in March. Not fixed. He'd given up the word fixed as a destination, the way his therapist had suggested, replacing it with something less like a destination and more like a direction. He had a new job, a smaller firm, a managing director who had called him in for the interview and said at the start of it, "I watched the video. I'm not interested in it. Tell me about your work." He'd started 3 weeks ago. He was learning the new rhythms of it. His mother had started therapy herself, which she'd told him on the phone one evening in July, in the same tone she used for most significant information, matter of fact, with a slight defensiveness around the edges that he recognized as covering vulnerability. He'd said he thought that was good. She'd said she didn't want a prize for it. He'd said he wasn't giving her one, just noting it. Their relationship was not repaired. He didn't know if repaired was the right word for what it might become. It had never been quite right, had been built on dynamics that needed more than repair, needed reconstruction from different materials. They were attempting that. Slowly, imperfectly, with the specific awkwardness of two people who'd spent decades in a pattern trying to find a different one. Marcus had asked him recently if Victoria was happy. He'd thought about how to answer that. "I think so," he said finally. "I think she's building something she wants." "Good," Marcus said, and went back to his homework with the finality of someone who had required that information and had now filed it correctly. Daniel looked at the clip one more time. "Victoria at the microphone, keep showing up, just present in the actual room." He understood what she meant. He understood it in a way he hadn't in March, which was the particular education that losing something teaches you about what you had. He'd stood 3 feet away from her in a ballroom and not moved. He had moved since then. Not toward her. He understood clearly that the door between them had closed. Not in bitterness, not even in judgment exactly, but simply because some doors close when they close, and what's on the other side becomes its own life. He had moved toward himself, which was harder in some ways, and which had been, he was learning, the thing he'd needed to do long before a gala at the Grand Monarch Hotel made the need undeniable. He put his phone down. He went to Marcus's room and checked on him, which he did every night. An old habit, one of the good ones. Marcus was asleep with a library book on his pillow, which was also an old habit. Daniel took the book and set it on the nightstand and stood in his son's doorway for a moment, watching him the way parents watch sleeping children, with the particular combination of love and fear and something that was almost gratitude for the specific weight of the responsibility. He went to bed. The last Saturday of September, the Paulina Street building had all 6 units occupied, and the volunteer schedule had shifted to maintenance and finish work. Rosalind had organized a small breakfast for the volunteers. Nothing formal, just the community center's kitchen and enough coffee and eggs for the people who'd spent 6 months on those floors. Victoria arrived at 8, the same time she always arrived. Nathan arrived 2 minutes later, Lily beside him with a new book. The first in a different series, the old one resolved. They sat at a table in the community center kitchen and ate eggs off paper plates and talked about nothing consequential and everything comfortable. And Jerome, the teenager who'd started as court-mandated community service and was now showing up on Sundays too, sat across from them and ate 3 servings of eggs and told nobody in particular that he was thinking about construction engineering as a field, which he delivered with the defensive nonchalance of a teenager sharing something that mattered to him and not wanting that to be too visible. Nathan looked at him. "I can tell you about how you get there, if you want." Jerome shrugged, which meant yes. Victoria watched this exchange. Nathan speaking plainly and practically about load calculations and project management and the route from here to there, Jerome listening with his defensive posture gradually loosening. And she thought about all the ways that things propagate. Not just the bad things, which went viral and trended and became a mirror for millions. The ordinary things too, the passing of knowledge across a breakfast table, the Tuesday morning that a man showed up at a job site and gave the same respect to everyone in the room regardless of their role, the 7-year-old who processed the world through stories and would, in some form, keep doing that her whole life, building her understanding through the act of telling it back. She thought about the woman in Memphis and the man in Seattle and the 19-year-old with the straight back and Sandra's daughter in the closet doorway. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in a classroom and a clip about character, and about what it meant that that particular piece of the story had outlasted the outrage and the trending phrases and the collapse of a family's business empire. Character, not circumstance. She'd said it as 4 words in a statement. It had turned out to mean something longer. Lily finished her eggs and looked at Victoria with the directness that was her particular inheritance. "Will you come to my birthday?" she said. "It's in September, 3 weeks." Victoria looked at Nathan, who gave her the minimal expression of a person who had not orchestrated this and was letting it run its own course. "I would like that very much," Victoria said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and opened her new book. The morning light came through the community center windows at the angle it came through all Chicago windows in late September. That specific slant that meant the season was changing again, that summer's long commitment was winding toward something cooler and quieter. Outside, Paulina Street held its building, 6 units occupied, families sleeping in bedrooms with closet doors that closed, and windows with actual light coming through them. Victoria sat at a table in a community center kitchen with eggs getting cold on a paper plate and a 7-year-old reading beside her, and a man who noticed things without performing the noticing, and she thought, this is the room I was looking for. Not this literal room, with its linoleum floor and its donated coffee maker and the smear of paint on the window frame from 3 weeks ago that nobody had gotten around to cleaning. But this, the quality of it. The absence of calibration, the sense of being in a place where the only credential that mattered was whether you showed up and whether, when you got there, you were actually present. She'd moved to Lincoln Park in a yellow dress, looking for a room like this. She'd walked through a ballroom in the Grand Monarch Hotel in March, and been handed a kind of clarity that she'd have traded at the time for almost anything, but that she couldn't trade back now, even if she wanted to. She'd rebuilt the months since with her own hands, one Saturday at a time, and what she'd built didn't look like what she'd expected. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others. It had paint smears and linoleum floors and a 7-year-old with a cape on her dress. She wouldn't have designed it. She was grateful she hadn't. Imperfection, she'd learned, was not the opposite of good. It was frequently the shape that good actually took, irregular and uncoordinated, and arrived at sideways. Nothing like the version you'd planned. Edward Sinclair had told her she'd read Daniel correctly. Just the wrong chapter. What she understood now, sitting in September light with eggs getting cold, was that the chapter she'd needed had been this one all along, not the chapter where love looked the way she expected it to look, neat and deliberate and without maintenance, but the chapter where it looked like 2 people sitting on steps eating sandwiches while a child explained dragon politics, and neither of them needed to name what it was to know that it was good. The coffee maker finished its cycle and beeped once. Jerome helped himself to another cup. Rosalind came through with a stack of papers that needed attention and put them at the end of the table with the quiet authority of someone who ran things. Nathan said something to Jerome about load calculations that made Jerome pull out his phone to write something down. Lily turned a page. Victoria drank her coffee. Outside, Chicago was deciding, in its habitual way, that the season had changed. This is where the story ends. Not with resolution in the dramatic sense, because that kind of resolution mostly belongs to the version of things that's been compressed and repackaged for an audience. The real version ends in ordinary rooms, on ordinary mornings, with paper plates and cold eggs, and the quiet understanding that the life you actually have is built from the days you were present for it, not the ones you performed. Victoria Sinclair was 30 years old and imperfect in learning, still learning, the difference between managing distance and closing it. The gala video still lived on the internet, would live there longer than she'd be alive to know it. The yellow dress hung in her closet in Lincoln Park, not as a relic, but as a piece of clothing she still wore sometimes because she still liked the color. She was not healed exactly. She was building. And that, it turned out, was enough.